Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep. Welcome to another session on international relations. So today, we will be starting with module number 4. Under this chapter, we will be studying India's relations with Myanmar. I hope you remember that last week, we had started with the eastern neighbors of India and we had covered India's relations with Bangladesh. Now let's take up another important eastern neighbor, that is Myanmar. So today, we will learn many important details about Myanmar. Myanmar happens to be one of the most important neighbors for India. And Myanmar is not just any ordinary neighbor, it's a Southeast Asian neighbor. Because geographically, Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country. So Myanmar becomes this connection for India to link and connect with the Southeast Asia region, which is so important for India in its foreign policy. So we share land and maritime boundaries with Myanmar, with the Southeast Asian country. And this could become the gateway for India to promote its Act East policy. Remember, I mentioned in the previous classes as well, that we have a policy dedicated towards Southeast Asia and East Asia, known as the Act East policy. The previous version of it was called the Look East policy. So under this policy, India has been prioritizing Southeast Asia region. And since Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country and a neighbor of India, it becomes a gateway or a land bridge that connects India with the Southeast Asia region. So this is where the importance of Myanmar lies for India. It acts as a connection, a gateway, or a land bridge that connects India with the Southeast Asia region. So this is what makes Myanmar very significant for India. So let's start this chapter by first understanding more about its strategic location. I'll be using a couple of maps to explain some important details to highlight the significance of Myanmar. So I would suggest that you please write down these key points. There will be around 4 or 5 points we'll be discussing. So please make a note of all these points because I do expect a mains question to be asked on these lines. UPSC might ask you to explain why Myanmar is significant for India, or how is Myanmar's location vital for Indian interest in the region. So such a location-based question might be asked in mains, and you have to present these arguments, present these 4 to 5 points, and explain them in detail to highlight why Myanmar is so important for India. All right. So let's start this discussion by looking at these 2 maps that I have shared over here. Now the first point that we can add over here is that Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country. This itself is a very important fact for India. As a Southeast Asian neighbor, it acts as a land bridge that connects the northeast region of India. India's northeast is getting connected with Southeast Asia. Is that clear? In the last chapter as well, we studied how India has been trying to develop the northeast region, how we are trying to improve connectivity to the northeast. So Bangladesh provides that opportunity to us to create alternate routes to northeast India and provide better development opportunities to northeast India. Similarly, just like Bangladesh, even Myanmar gives us alternate access to the northeast. Via Myanmar, we can pursue alternate routes. We can pursue alternate routes to connect with northeast India. This reduces our dependency on Siliguri corridor. It improves connections with northeast India, and further, we can connect the northeast markets with the Southeast Asian markets. So kindly make a note of this point. The first important point is that Myanmar is a Southeast Asian neighbor. It gives us a direct connection to the whole of Southeast Asia. And by linking Northeast India with Myanmar, we can create alternate routes, improve connectivity, provide better development, and link the markets of Northeast India with Southeast Asian markets. From Northeast India, the goods that are produced can be exported to Southeast Asian markets. From Southeast Asia, investments can be attracted to Northeast India. From countries like, let's say, Singapore, Malaysia. From here, we can drive investments to the Northeast of India to create more job opportunities. And the commodities produced in Northeast can be exported to Southeast Asian countries. And this is where Myanmar can play a critical role as part of our Act East policy. Understood? So this is the first point. Next, the second point. We share a very long border with Myanmar. The border is around 1,640 kilometers approximately. That is the approximate length of this border. And there are some important northeastern states that share this boundary. Now, if you look at the map, you can find out which are these Indian states, Northeast Indian states, that share this immediate land boundary with Myanmar. We have Arunachal Pradesh over here, followed by Nagaland. This is Manipur. You can see here in this map, this is Manipur here. And then Mizoram. These are the 4 states in the Northeast which share this long border, this important border with Myanmar. So Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram. Now, why is it such an important point? What if such a long border is present? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? Right? This border that you see here, it's a very complicated border. The terrain, the geography is very complex, just like India-Bangladesh border or just like the India-Nepal border. You have hilly mountainous areas. You have some very remote locations here along the border which don't have good connectivity or good infrastructure. And also the region is densely forested. So as a result, the terrain is very complex and there are many natural gaps in the border, which makes it a highly porous border. Understood? So this long boundary that India shares with Myanmar is actually a complicated boundary. The terrain, the geography itself is complex that creates these natural gaps, which makes it difficult to secure the border. So as a result, it's a highly porous border and there are many threats that are present for India. So from a national security point of view, with regard to our border security and even internal security, there are many challenges, many direct threats that emanate from here. For example, organized crime is very rampant along this border. All types of organized crime is seen to be prevalent in this region. And the reason why organized crime thrives along the Myanmar border is because this region here, it's part of the Golden Triangle. This is the Golden Triangle region. The Golden Triangle refers to the junction of 3 countries in Southeast Asia. That is Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. The junction of these 3 countries is referred to as the Golden Triangle. So where Myanmar meets with Laos and Thailand, this is referred to as the Golden Triangle. Because this is a reference to the criminal activities that flourish in this region. All sorts of criminal activities can be found here, including drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking. So all these criminal activities flourish in this region, and of late it has even become a hub of cyber criminal groups. There are several cyber criminal organizations operating out of Myanmar, that do the forested areas of Myanmar and Thailand. Is that clear? Plus, there are many criminal cartels involved in drug production. They produce a lot of drugs in this region. These drugs are later smuggled and trafficked across the world, and a lot of these drugs enter India as well via the Myanmar border. So there is an easy availability of weapons. There is wildlife and human trafficking as well. Humans are smuggled across the border, and they're often pushed into prostitution, forced labor, and this represents a major threat. Even hunting and poaching in the forests of Northeast India is very rampant, because wildlife products find a big market in this region, in the Golden Triangle, where wildlife commodities are also trafficked and smuggled. Now, these illegal activities, these organized illegal activities, they are directly connected with money laundering, and they share direct connections with terrorism and insurgency. So this is the real threat faced by India. The presence of such criminal activities destabilizes the border area. These criminal organizations, they operate across the border in India as well. And there are several outfits in Northeast India, especially insurgent outfits, which move across the border and get involved in these criminal activities. As you know, the Northeast region has been very badly affected by insurgency for decades, right from 1950s. Across the Northeast region, we have seen multiple insurgencies, right? Many of these insurgent groups, they find a support base across the border in Myanmar. Is that clear? They get in touch with these criminal organizations, and they source drugs, weapons, and all the support that they need, and even launder money to these channels. So this creates a support network for these insurgent and terrorist organizations that are targeting India. And not just that, Myanmar has become a safe haven for Northeast insurgents. Various Northeast insurgent outfits, they have found a base in Myanmar. They have found it quite easy to move across the border, because it's a porous border they can infiltrate across, and they operate safely over here, and they even get some support, not from Myanmar's government, but the local ethnic groups. The local ethnic groups, they share connections with the ethnic groups on the Indian side. There are several ethnic tribal communities in the Northeast region, which are closely connected with ethnic tribal groups of Myanmar. Even they have their own insurgent movements going on in Myanmar, and they support each other. So Northeast insurgents, such as, let's say, Mizo insurgents, or the Kuki insurgents in Manipur, even NSCN, the Naga insurgents, Ulfa, and few other outfits, they have easily found a support base across the border. So whenever they have come under pressure from Indian security forces, these insurgents, they infiltrate across the border and they find a safe haven where they can hide and operate freely from this region. Is that clear? It becomes a terror sanctuary. The connection between ethnic tribes, even though it forms a cultural bond, a historical cultural bond, there is a risk factor for India, because many of the tribes, they do have a connection on the other side. Take, for example, Nagas, the Naga ethnic group. It's a very large ethnic clan, and there are many sub-Naga groups within it. So Nagas are not just limited to Nagaland of India. Nagas can be found in Assam as well, in Arunachal Pradesh as well, in Manipur as well. And Nagas are found across the border in Myanmar as well. So Naga insurgent outfits like NSCN, the NSCN, which has been a notorious insurgent outfit, has found an easy support base across the border with the help of the local Nagas present on the other side of the border. In fact, the goal of NSCN has been to liberate these Naga inhabited areas and unite them to form the Naga Limb, or the so-called Greater Nagaland. This has been the stated goal of NSCN for many, many years. It wants to break away all the Naga inhabited areas in India, from Arunachal Pradesh to Nagaland to Assam to Manipur, and as well as the Naga inhabited areas in Myanmar, and bring all these areas together to form the so-called Naga Limb, or the Greater Nagaland. Even other groups such as Kukis, they are connected with the Chin and the Zong community on the other side of the border. Recently, you might have heard about massive ethnic violence in Manipur. Right? In Manipur, there has been ethnic violence that has broken out again between the majority Metis and the minority Kukis. Kukis are designated as a hill tribe in India. They have the scheduled tribe status. The Metis, who have always been in majority and they have been dominant as well, right? Even they are fighting for the ST status, because getting the ST status gives them a lot of privileges. So this has reopened the ethnic divide in Manipur, and very violent clashes have broken out between Metis insurgents and Kuki insurgents. Both sides have been targeting each other, and the whole state has been destabilized again with the revival of these armed outfits. Metis outfits have been very dangerous and deadly in the past. Even Kuki insurgents have been very dangerous for Indian security interests. So these clashes that have broken out in Manipur, it has a connection with Myanmar. The Kuki insurgents, right, they do get the support of the Chins and the Zo community on the other side of the border. Even the Mizos are connected to the Chin community. When Mizo insurgency was raging until 1980s, right, Mizo insurgents like the MNF, the Mizo National Front, they had connections with the Chin community on the other side of the border, and they used to get support from the other side of the border. The Chins are native to Myanmar. They're found right along the India-Myanmar border on the Myanmar side, and the Chins have their own insurgency going on in Myanmar. So since all these groups are involved in armed movements, insurgent movements, they support each other, provide shelter to each other, and they even get in touch with these criminal cartels, where they can easily procure drugs, weapons, and get involved in other criminal activities. So this is one way of raising finances for their acts of terrorism and insurgency as well. Some of the Northeast insurgents, they not only find a shelter here, but they also smuggle drugs, right? The drugs are used for pushing the youth to addiction, which makes it easier for them to indoctrinate the youth and brainwash them, so they can radicalize them and make them join these insurgent outfits. And they also smuggle the drugs for a commission, through which they raise finances for their terror activities. They easily procure arms and weapons, right? They easily push their cadres across the border, keep them safe along the border in Myanmar, and then launch attacks from there against India. So this has become a very common occurrence. So there are major security threats that India has faced along this border for many, many years. So securing this border, dealing with our security challenges, is a top priority for India. Tackling organized crime, tackling money laundering, terror financing, and countering insurgency and terrorism in the region has been a top priority for India. Is that clear? So kindly make a note of these important points. Next, don't forget, along with the land border, we share a maritime border as well with Myanmar. Right? Bay of Bengal becomes a common link between the two countries. So in the Bay of Bengal, there are plenty of resources that are present. It offers a route for connectivity as well. So this is something we would like to explore with Myanmar. Joint resource exploration in Bay of Bengal. Connectivity through Bay of Bengal so that India can connect better with Myanmar and Southeast Asia, and this could open new routes, alternate routes to the northeast region of India as well. Right? So this has been a big priority for us. So India has been involved in some major connectivity projects. We have funded many important projects in Myanmar, and we're going to study this today. We're going to look at these Indian investments in Myanmar. So by and large, these are the various factors that make Myanmar very, very important for India. Its strategic location becomes vital for us because of all these points that I have raised. Is that clear? So to sum up, Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country acting as a land bridge to link Northeast India with Southeast Asia. This will help drive development to the Northeast and create alternate routes, which is one of the objectives of Act East policy. We share a long, porous border, which is very vulnerable to security threats. The terrain is very complex. There is a presence of organized criminal activities in the Golden Triangle region. There is a presence of money laundering networks. And along the border, there is a safe haven, a terror sanctuary that exists for several Northeast insurgent outfits. So the security threat is quite serious. And the ethnic connections between these different tribes and native groups complicates the challenges for India. Even though it's a common cultural link, it does pose a bigger challenge for India in dealing with the security threats. And then finally, the maritime boundary that we share in Bay of Bengal creates an area for cooperation where we can explore resources together, take up joint projects, focus on joint connectivity initiatives to improve regional connectivity. Right? So these are the priorities that we have, and that is why Myanmar is very, very significant for India. Is that clear? So I hope you guys have understood these basic points, because everything that we're going to discuss after this is based on this. Right? For the next 2 hours, whatever we are going to study, everything is related to these points that I've raised at the very beginning. So if this is clear, I would like to proceed with the next part. I want you guys to take a look at this slide, which highlights the interests and priorities of India. Essentially, whatever we discussed just now, I put them down in specific points so that it will help you in your notes making. So Myanmar's importance for India lies in our defense and border security, mainly to counter insurgency and organized crime. This has been our top priority for us all the while. And next, with regard to development of Northeast India, where it is a land bridge to connect with Southeast Asia and provides opportunities for greater connectivity. Understood? Now, there's another important angle to these security challenges that we are facing in Myanmar. There are hostile countries which have used Myanmar as a base to extend support to Northeast insurgents. Now, remember in the last class, that is when we were studying Bangladesh, I had explained how Northeast insurgents found a safe haven in Bangladesh as well. Right? Various Northeast insurgent groups, they have found a support base in Bangladesh previously under hostile Bangladeshi governments. That is when Bangladesh was under military rule, and when it was ruled by the BNP, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which was pro-Pakistan. These hostile Bangladeshi governments had given support to Northeast insurgents from 1970s till early 2000. During those 30-40 years, Northeast insurgents got a lot of support in Bangladesh as well. Apart from Bangladesh, even Pakistan has played a role. Pakistan's ISI, which is Pakistan's intelligence agency, had used Bangladesh as a launchpad to support these Northeast insurgents, supply them with funds and weapons to wage this war against India. So there's an involvement of other hostile countries in creating these security problems. Via Bangladesh, Pakistan also was playing a role in giving some kind of support to Northeast insurgents. We deal with something similar in Myanmar. In Myanmar, apart from support that comes from the local ethnic groups, there is a hostile country which is extending support to them, which is China. China has been using Myanmar as a base to provide direct support to Northeast insurgency. Because China is very influential in Myanmar. It's one of the most influential powers in the country. It has a lot of investments, it has a lot of leverage with Myanmar's government. So China has used this opportunity, or it has misused this opportunity to target India and destabilize India, especially after the 1962 war with China. Since then, China has maintained close contacts with Northeast rebels. These insurgent groups, the Naga insurgent outfits, insurgent groups from Manipur and Mizoram, even ULFA, NDFB, right, and the All Tripura Tiger Force, all these deadly insurgent groups that have found a base here, they've got support from Chinese intelligence agencies as well. China has been channeling funds and weapons into the hands of these insurgents by using Myanmar as a base for these covert operations. So this has been China's covert proxy war against India to destabilize the Northeast region of India. So historically, we have faced a major security challenge, a direct threat to our sovereignty, right? The presence of these terrorist safe havens in Bangladesh and Myanmar, where there's an involvement of Pakistan and China, has been one of our biggest security nightmares. So this is the reason why our neighbors like Myanmar become very important. At any cost, we have to maintain good relations with these countries, and we need to promote friendly relations with such governments. See, Myanmar government itself has usually not given such direct support to insurgency against India, right? So what India has done is that it has cultivated a very unique policy towards Myanmar. Since Myanmar itself is not directly involved in backing them, right? India realized that we should get the support of the Myanmar government on our side to tackle the security threats, or else the Northeast region would have become even more unstable. So on these national security grounds, on the grounds of the sovereignty of India in the Northeast, India had to focus on Myanmar and cultivate very friendly and good relations with Myanmar, irrespective of who was in power. Because see, Myanmar has gone through a lot of political turmoil. In the past and even today, Myanmar has witnessed, it is still witnessing a lot of political turmoil. Myanmar had a democratic government at one point. It had a limited democratic government at one point. But later, it was taken over by the military. Myanmar's army has been quite notorious for its political interference. For many decades, it's the military which is in control in Myanmar. So Myanmar's army toppled the government many, many years ago and established its military rule, which is referred to as the rule of the junta. In international relations, when military rule is established, it's often referred to as the junta rule or the rule of the junta. All right? Wherever military dictatorships come up through military coups, where elected governments, democratic governments are thrown out, and the military captures power for itself, right? In such cases, it's referred to as the junta rule or the rule of the junta. So despite Myanmar being an authoritarian dictatorial state, where there are no fundamental rights, where human rights have been crushed and violated, despite all these violations that have happened, India has still cultivated a very close, friendly relationship with Myanmar's government. We haven't really bothered who's in power in Myanmar, be it a democratic government, be it the military rule. We have cultivated very good relations with either of them because India has major national interests to protect. Now let's say India gets idealistic on the lines of human rights, democratic rights. If we try to criticize Myanmar's military for all the violations it commits, then we are going to alienate the military, which is going to get closer to China. And even Myanmar's military might start backing the Northeast insurgents. That would be an absolute nightmare for India, right? So this is where India has adopted a very realistic policy towards Myanmar. Remember, in the first class, we studied about two schools of thought in international relations: the idealist school of thought and the realist school of thought. The idealist school of thought believes you should focus more on ideals, principles, values, and ethics, right? So that approach is good sometimes. It upholds your core beliefs, your core principles. But sometimes in geopolitics, you can't be idealistic. Sometimes you have to keep aside your idealism, you have to ignore your ethics, values, principles, and focus on realism. Focus on realistic foreign policy goals by following a pragmatic foreign policy. That is exactly what India has done in Myanmar. We have looked away from the internal problems of Myanmar. Right? Internally, there are many problems in Myanmar, not just the political problem. There are many insurgencies going on. Myanmar's army has almost committed a genocide against a minority group. It has triggered a massive refugee crisis. So in the last 60, 70 years, Myanmar has committed some brutal violations. It has been sidelined by the entire world. It's under sanctions from many countries. But India has ignored all of this. We have kept all of this aside and we have built very close strategic ties with Myanmar. We have built very close strategic relations with Myanmar. And this is the realist policy of India. Such a policy can be referred to as realpolitik. Realpolitik is a term in geopolitics which was popularized by Henry Kissinger, the then National Security Advisor of the United States. Later, he became the Secretary of State as well. Realpolitik refers to the pursuit of realist interest, the pursuit of pragmatic interest, right, where you prioritize your national interest over ideals, principles, and values. I know it sounds cold-hearted sometimes. If you're ignoring ethics principles, if you're ignoring human rights abuses, right, and if you're giving them funds and weapons as well, right, it does sound wrong, morally wrong, ethically wrong. But sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Right? Internally, India can't interfere. We can't really make changes inside of Myanmar. If we were to interfere, let's say we were to criticize Myanmar's military, let's say we were to join the Western countries in imposing sanctions, that strategy will only backfire because Myanmar's military will turn against India. Myanmar's military is already very close to China, so they'll collude with China to give even more support to the insurgent outfits. That will destabilize our northeast region, affect our security interests. So instead of that, wouldn't it be better to not interfere inside Myanmar, allow them to do what they want, right? And instead build practical relations with whoever is in power and build a strategic relationship so that at least your security interest can be protected. And that is exactly what India has done because India didn't have another choice, right? You see that happening in the case of Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. We know for a fact that Russia has done wrong things. It was Russia which violated international law by invading Ukraine, right? But we have such major interests with Russia and a historical partnership and friendship where Russia has always backed India. So keeping those interests in mind, we have ignored the violations in Ukraine and still backed Russia every single time. We have not followed Western sanctions against Russia. We have never voted against Russia even once in the last 1.5 years. Many resolutions have been brought up at the UN criticizing Russia, but India has not voted. We have abstained from all those votes. So that is again a realistic policy of India in order to maintain the strategic relations with Russia. And we balance that with very pragmatic ties with Western countries as well. Right? You see something similar with Myanmar. With Myanmar as well, India has been very realistic from 1950s, 1960s itself. It's not a new policy. It's not that this happened in the last few years. This has been our consistent approach since the 1960s. Despite all the internal problems and political turmoil and human rights violations, violation of democratic rights, etc., India has built very good strategic relations with the government of Myanmar, especially Myanmar's army. We have made very big investments, supplied weapons to them as well. We have conducted joint exercises, joint military trainings, right? And we have managed to counter the Chinese influence in order to protect our national interests, in order to safeguard our borders and safeguard the Northeast region. This had been a necessity for India because Northeast insurgency had broken out as early as 1950s. The Naga insurgency had started as soon as India became independent, right? Then insurgency broke out in Manipur and Mizoram in the 1960s. Then in 1970s, insurgencies broke out in Assam, in Tripura. Many of these insurgents had a support base in Myanmar where they had contacts with Chinese intelligence. We knew that China was supplying funds and weapons to them. So it was a dire circumstance for India. India was pushed to the corner. So to uphold our sovereignty, to protect the Northeast region and counter insurgency and all the security threats, we had to build close relations with Myanmar. Is that clear? So we will study the political history of Myanmar. I'll take you through the major political history of Myanmar. You have to understand the current situation as well. So this explanation will help you understand our approach towards Myanmar. India has followed a very realistic approach. We have followed a policy of realpolitik, where we have been realistic and pragmatic in our approach, and we have kept aside idealism. We have ignored all the internal violations, and despite all the violations the military has committed, we have built very, very close ties with the military junta in Myanmar. After China, if you ask me which country is the most influential in Myanmar, it is India. China has always been influential, right? Because the military junta is a communist state. The military junta of Myanmar is inspired by communist principles. So it's naturally very close to China and even to Russia. Russia has supplied a lot of weapons to Myanmar. China has always been a sponsor. It has made billions of dollars in investments. It has given security support and supplied weapons to Myanmar's military, given diplomatic support as well. So China and Russia are naturally close to Myanmar's military. But apart from these communist powers, it is India which is the next most influential power in Myanmar. We've been able to do this by cultivating a very practical, a realistic approach where we have helped Myanmar where needed and in return taken the help of Myanmar where it is crucial for us. Now Myanmar, if it needs funds, we'll provide funds. If it needs weapons, we'll supply weapons. Is that clear? If it needs diplomatic support, we'll do that indirectly at least. That is, we'll not follow Western sanctions, right? We'll not vote against them directly. So such indirect support can be provided by India. In return, we expect Myanmar to help us protect our borders and security. We expect Myanmar's military to help us in tackling organized crime, in checking infiltration, in countering the insurgent groups, the terrorist groups. This is the transactional equation that we have established, right? So this is the realistic approach, the realpolitik approach of India to safeguard and protect our interests in the region. Understood? Now let's see what other interests we do have in Myanmar, and then I'll take you through the brief political history of Myanmar. Understand the background also becomes important sometimes, because right now Myanmar is going through another phase of crisis. So UPSC might ask you a question on the internal problems of Myanmar and how it affects India. In the last 3 years itself, Myanmar is again back into the mode of a political crisis. Right? It's facing a very serious crisis inside the country, and this has a bearing on India, it has an impact on India. So UPSC might ask a question on the internal situation of Myanmar, and without the background, you can never write a good answer to it. So let's study the brief political history of Myanmar and how it impacts India. But before that, let us see what are the interests and priorities we have with this country. So apart from the long land and maritime boundaries, we have established that Myanmar is strategically vital for India. both for internal and external reasons, right? Primarily for security and strategic reasons. For security and strategic reasons, Myanmar has been vital. Our primary objective has been to ensure political stability in Myanmar. Because as I told you, the country has seen long periods of military rule. It has been affected by ethnic violence, insurgencies, large-scale communal riots, right? So as a result, Myanmar has gone through a lot of political and social turmoil. And any turmoil in our neighborhood is not good for India. These events can spill over. They can have a spillover effect, and it might destabilize our border areas. Is that clear? So our top priority in Myanmar has been to ensure political and social stability in the country. So whatever possible from India's end, we will do that to stabilize Myanmar politically and socially. So this is another major goal of India, one of the top priorities of India. Other than that, we do seek friendly relations so that we can work together and exploit the common geography, the common history, the common culture that we share with each other. There is in fact a civilizational relationship, a historical relationship dating back to ancient medieval times that we share with Myanmar. Is that clear? There have been various kingdoms and empires that have formed a historical connection between India and today's Myanmar, be it Hinduism and even Buddhism. Both the religions have been a common connect. You do find strong connections between India and Myanmar, which are cultural religious connections. See, Myanmar today is a Buddhist country. It's a majority Buddhist nation. Please remember this point. Myanmar is a majority Buddhist state. And apart from Buddhism being a strong cultural link, right, you find traces of Hindu connection as well, traces of Hindu linkages as a result of various kingdoms and empires since ancient medieval times. You even have a strong Tamil community, a very strong Tamil community, which has formed a direct bond between Myanmar and India. Now, some of you might be surprised. How come Tamilians are found here, so far away from southern India, right? And that's an interesting part of history. Since many decades and a couple of centuries, Tamil traders, Tamil businessmen, right, they largely moved out from southern India, usually to the Bay of Bengal route, and they established trading linkages with Southeast Asia, from Singapore to Malaysia to Thailand to all the way to Myanmar. Even during the British rule, the Tamil traders were encouraged they would settle down in Myanmar as well, right, along the today's border of India, Myanmar. And many of them have remained over there for generations together. And this is not just a modern link in the colonial period. Even historically, there have been Tamil empires and kingdoms which were trading with these parts of the world. For example, the Cholas, the Pallavas, right? These were maritime powers. They had major naval forces through which they dominated Southeast Asia historically. From Indonesia to Cambodia, right? This whole part of Southeast Asia have been dominated by these Indian empires and kingdoms. We had a trading relationship with the Song dynasty in China, the Cholas. They built this strong trading relationship via the Malacca Strait and South China Sea, and they used to trade with the Song dynasty in China. That is why you find a strong Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic connection that binds India and Southeast Asia even today. If you've ever been to, let's say, Thailand or Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia, to places like Bali, right, or even Cambodia, you find very strong traces of Indian connection, either to Hinduism or Islam or Buddhism. There's a strong religious connect. You look at the language that is spoken, many of the dialects and the words that are used, the food, the festivals, right? There are many common things that bind us with Southeast Asia since historical times, right? So Tamil kingdoms, like Cholas especially, they had a reach and influence across this region. These were built upon during the colonial times again, and many Tamil traders and businessmen, they would travel through the Bay of Bengal to the maritime route, establish a strong trading link with Southeast Asian markets. That's why even today you find a strong Tamil diaspora in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia as well, right? So in Myanmar, along the northeast border of India, along the borders of Nagaland and Manipur, there are few trading points where the Tamil traders are very dominant even today. But at one point they were pushed out. When Myanmar's military took over in 1960s, when it carried out a military coup, the Tamil diaspora was targeted. They were asked to quit the business and leave and go back to India. So many of them were displaced, but some of them remained. You still find a Tamil community right along the border, either inside Myanmar or sometimes in Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram area. So there are these deep-rooted cultural links, economic links, historical links, which offers an opportunity today for further cooperation with Myanmar. So these are the major interests that we have. And as a result, it becomes important for you to understand the political history of this country. You should know the brief political history of Myanmar. There is a troubled history. And these events that have happened, that is still happening, has an impact on Indian interests. All right. Now that we know what are India's interests, right, we've studied that in detail. So it's better we focus on the history of Myanmar and how it impacts India, how the current situation impacts India. Right. This is the major part of the discussion. The rest of the topics are pretty small, but this is the major part of the discussion. So let's take a look at the history of Myanmar's internal politics. See, Myanmar, as you know, it was previously called Burma. Burma was a colonial name. It was a British colony, just like India. Kindly remember this point. But it was not part of British India. All right. Burma was a separate colony on its own. It was a British colony, and it gained independence in 1948, just 1 year after India's independence. So since then, for majority of its independent history, Myanmar has been ruled by the military. Please look at this fact. For almost 60 years, out of its 70 odd years of independence, Myanmar has been ruled by the military junta. Myanmar's army has been in power. So you can imagine what happens when you have such a prolonged period of military dictatorship. Because in a military dictatorship, there are no fundamental rights, no democratic rights. Human rights are often violated and crushed. And 60 years of military rule can devastate any country. That's exactly what has happened in Myanmar. It's a great tragedy, a political and human tragedy that has happened in Myanmar. So Burma, as it was known under the British, would become independent in 1948. And in this independence movement, a leader known as Aung San, played a very, very important role in the independence movement of the country. You can see Aung San in this image over here, right? He's considered as the founding father of Myanmar. At least he was. All right. He was the one who led the independence movement against British colonial rule, and he led Myanmar to independence in 1948. So under the leadership of Aung San, the country gained independence from British rule, and it transitioned into a democratic state. It had some kind of limited democracy from 1948 till 1962. Is that clear? But in 1962, Myanmar's military, which had kept its eyes on the power structure of the government, right? It also blamed the government for all the problems that was plaguing the country. In these 14 years, from 1948 to 1962, Myanmar was struggling internally. Its economy was not growing. There were a lot of social and ethnic challenges. There are many different ethnic groups, just like the northeast of India. It's a multi-diverse ethnic society. So many ethnic tribes had rebelled against the Myanmar government. They had taken up insurgency. So a lot of violence and destabilization had happened, and economic growth had been compromised. And apparently, the government also was seen as a very corrupt government. Using these excuses, the military toppled the government and carried out a military coup in the year 1962. Myanmar's army was just waiting for an excuse to take over the political structures. It would blame the government for all the problems of the country, the social problems, the security problems, the economic challenges. Right? They were all blamed on the government. It was alleged that the government was a corrupt government, and the military took over by throwing this government out. It was a military coup. I hope everyone understands what is a military coup. Military coup occurs when the military throws out the legitimate government of a country. When the legitimate recognized government of the country, which is usually an elected government, if such a government is thrown out, right, the recognized government, if all countries, including UN, if they recognize a government of a particular country, right, it might be democratic or it may not be democratic. If the legitimate government is thrown out by the military and the military takes over and captures power, that is called a military coup. All right, and the rule of the military is referred to as the junta rule, the rule of the junta. So in 1962, the country came under military rule, and it continued to remain under military rule all the way until 2010. From 1962 to 2010, Myanmar was ruled by the military, entirely by the military. During this period of 50 years, almost 50 years, large-scale human rights violations happened in the country. Many minority groups were targeted. Democratic protesters were targeted. So there has been large-scale violations throughout this period by the military. But still, India would look away from these violations as Myanmar was crucial for India. Right? We would never criticize the military for all the internal violations it was carrying out. We knew what the military was doing. We knew it was wrong. But we also realized there's nothing we can do about it. If India tries to criticize Myanmar's military, and if we were to join other countries in targeting Myanmar, then the military would turn against India and align with China. That would be a nightmare for us, because that would completely destabilize the northeast region, as insurgency and terrorism was raging in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So in order to counter this threat, India adopted the realistic policy, followed a realpolitik approach, and built very close ties with Myanmar's military. Right? We ignored all the violations that were happening, never criticized Myanmar's military for all the problems, and instead, we built very strategic and close relations with the military rule. We gave them funds, weapons, we built a strategic partnership so that the army could help us in countering the security threats. In 1980s, there was one attempt by pro-democracy protesters. In 1988, a massive pro-democracy movement broke out in the country, which was led by Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of Aung San. Is that clear? The daughter of Aung San Suu Kyi, she's a very popular political leader, right? She gave leadership to this pro-democracy movement that broke out in the country in the 1980s, in 1988. But this movement, as you can expect, was crushed with brutal force by the military. The military wouldn't hesitate to kill civilian protesters, pro-democracy protesters. Unarmed civilians were killed and slaughtered by the military in large numbers, and this pro-democracy movement was crushed within few months. But again, India didn't say anything. We didn't criticize the military even once, despite the massive violations that the military had carried out. Following this, Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the movement, was placed under house arrest. The pro-democracy leader, the daughter of Aung San, was placed under house arrest, and she would remain under house arrest for years together. She's one of the rare political leaders in modern times who has spent most of her life in jail. Right? She has been placed under house arrest for many, many years. And even though her party managed to win the elections in 1990, they were denied the right to take over the government. Aung San Suu Kyi, she heads a democratic party called NLD, the National League for Democracy. In 1990, following the pro-democracy movement, elections were introduced because Myanmar's military was under global pressure, especially Western countries. The Western countries, led by the US and also by European countries, they were putting a lot of pressure on Myanmar, criticizing the violations. They were threatening Myanmar with sanctions. They were targeting Myanmar for committing these violations against civilian protesters and pro-democracy protesters. So because of the pressure, elections were introduced, and Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD clearly won the election. But despite that, the military refused to give up its control over power. It nullified the election results, placed Aung San Suu Kyi under prolonged house arrest, and erased any signs of democracy in the country. So following this, the Western countries imposed crippling economic sanctions against Myanmar. They brought out very strict economic sanctions to punish the military, to squeeze the military junta out of its funds for all the violations it had committed, the human rights violations and democratic violations it had committed. So Western countries were expecting India as well to join their group in criticizing Myanmar and in following the sanctions against Myanmar. But India refused. India refused to align with Western countries. The Western countries were shocked. They were surprised. How could a democratic country like India witness and tolerate these violations of human rights and democratic rights in a neighboring country? That was their question, right? India was simply following a realistic policy, which is the approach of any country. See, Western countries, they preach about democracy, they preach about human rights. But trust me, their genuine interest does not lie in democracy and human rights. For these countries, human rights and democracy is a selective approach. They have no issues when they work with authoritarian dictatorial governments like Saudi Arabia. They were very good friends with Gaddafi, right, who was the dictator of Libya. At one point, they used to work with dictators across Africa and West Asia. Even today, US and European countries, they have no issues at all in working with dictatorial authoritarian governments if it serves their interests. But only where they have a geopolitical interest, where they want to counter rivals like China or Russia, etc. Only there they will bring up the issue of democracy, human rights, and other issues. So India, which follows an independent foreign policy, right? We've studied our policy is rooted in the principle of strategic autonomy. We look after our own interests. We don't look after American interests or European interests. Indian interests dictated that we needed Myanmar's military to tackle Northeast insurgency. We needed the help of Myanmar to counter the Chinese influence and China's role in destabilizing Northeast India. That was our top priority, right? So we ignored the Western pressure. We ignored US and European countries and whatever they were saying. They were criticizing India, putting pressure on India. But we stood up against Western pressure and ignored all of this and continued our friendly approach with Myanmar. India bypassed these economic sanctions. We have never followed sanctions against Myanmar. Is that clear? Willingly, we have not followed the sanctions against Myanmar. We ignored all the sanctions and continued the close relations. So this situation continued for many more years. Throughout 1990s and early 2000, Aung San Suu Kyi would remain under house arrest. That is why she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was recognized by the Nobel Committee for her efforts to bring democracy in Myanmar, and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? Myanmar's military continued its hold over power. It continued some of the violations as well. But India ignored the Western pressure. We bypassed the Western economic sanctions and became one of the biggest investors in the country after China. After China, India remains one of the biggest investors. We took up many projects. We built closer economic ties. We supplied weapons, as I told you, and we would even conduct joint exercises and joint operations with the military. So that is the unique approach and the special relationship that India has cultivated. But then in 2007, some of the radical Buddhists, they triggered a revolution leading to unrest in the country again. In Myanmar, the radical Buddhists are extremely influential because of their internal political issues with the military. Right? There was a revolution that broke out. A violent protest movement was led by the radical Buddhists that led to the weakening of the political structure in Myanmar. So following these internal challenges, Myanmar tried to open up. It tried to open up. It also wanted to please the Western countries to lift the sanctions because the sanctions were crippling the country. Externally, the Western pressure was acting on Myanmar. See, Myanmar is blessed with resources. All right, most of its resources are untouched, except for a few countries like China. None of the others have exploited Myanmar's resources. So Myanmar's military wanted to exploit the resources, but it was not possible due to the crippling economic sanctions of Western countries. Its economy had been squeezed, and China's support alone was not enough. So Myanmar's military wanted to please the Western countries so they would lift the sanctions, thus opening up Myanmar's economy to the world. At the same time, they wanted to counter and deal with the internal problems. So in 2010, they showed some interest to cause changes, political changes and constitutional changes. They tried to show that the military was ready for political constitutional changes, and they released Aung San Suu Kyi from house arrest. This was a very big development. After nearly 2 decades of house arrest and crushing of pro-democracy movement, for the first time, Myanmar's military was opening up, right, to please the Western countries to lift the sanctions and also to stabilize its control over power, right? It opened up for some political constitutional changes, and Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest. Following this, a new constitution was adopted in 2010 to pave the way for a partial democracy. A partial democracy was introduced in the country. Is that clear? I'm saying it was a partial democracy because the elections that were held following this change and the government which was formed, it was still dominated by the military itself. The constitutional changes were such that in the new parliament, majority of the seats were reserved for military members. Is that clear? Even though Myanmar said it was transitioning to a constitutional democracy, the reality was that it was a nominal civilian government. Only for the sake of it was a civilian government. Very few seats in the parliament were allowed for elections, were open for elections, where civilians could contest, right? But majority of the seats were reserved for the military itself. Military officials would be nominated. The parliament was dominated by the military. The government was still dominated by the military. So only partial elections and democracy was introduced. So obviously, Western countries did not recognize the change. Western countries, they did not recognize the transition. And they continued the economic sanctions. They did not lift the economic sanctions as Myanmar was expecting. Because they saw that it was a farce. They really didn't transition to a democracy. There was no free and fair elections. Majority of the seats were reserved for the military itself, for nominated military officials. Government itself was still dominated by the military, and only a few seats had been thrown open for elections. This was a namesake democracy like Pakistan. Even Pakistan has a civilian government, elected civilian government. Pakistan is a democracy on the face of it, right? But everyone knows the civilian government is useless. It's powerless. The true power in Pakistan is controlled by the Pakistani military, the army, and the ISI, right? So something similar happened here in Myanmar in 2010. So even the elections happened in 2011, and a new government was formed that lasted until 2015. It lasted for 5 years. This was only a nominal and a partial democracy. So Western countries did not recognize the changes. They did not lift the sanctions. Whereas India welcomed the changes. India, as a close friend, we welcomed the transition that Myanmar was making. Even though it was a slow transition, India welcomed the change. India appreciated Myanmar's military. We supported the transition and welcomed the partial transition as well. But finally, the economic pressure started acting. The military had to make changes, or else Western countries would not budge. So in 2015, Myanmar transitioned into a full democracy. For the first time in 60 years, Myanmar was returning back to a democracy, and the military stepped aside. The military stepped aside, at least officially it stepped aside. A new constitution was brought out, constitutional changes were carried out, and fresh elections were announced in the country. Free and fair elections were held in 2015, and the political parties were given an opportunity to contest the elections freely. So by now, Aung San Suu Kyi was out of house arrest. In 2010 itself, she had been released, right? So her party, the NLD, the National League for Democracy, clearly won the elections and formed a democratic government for the next 5 years. From 2015 to 2020, Myanmar finally had an elected government in place, a democratic government in place, led by the NLD. But however, the reality was that the military would still control, the power structures from behind the scenes. Even though elections were allowed to happen on the front and democracy was installed on the face of it, in reality, from behind, the military was still in control, right? But still, it was a big transition for Myanmar. After 60 years, elections were held, an elected government was in place. So as a result, these changes were finally recognized by the West. Western countries recognized the changes and they lifted the sanctions against Myanmar. These sanctions which had been imposed, they were finally lifted and removed. And Western countries started re-establishing ties with Myanmar. So US, European Union, major European powers like UK, Germany, then even other developed countries like Japan, Australia, Canada, right? They all reached out to Myanmar and they started establishing their diplomatic relations because all of them were interested in playing a big role in Myanmar. Their main focus was the resources of Myanmar. which until then was accessible only to China, India, and maybe Russia. These have been the traditional powers in Myanmar. They have had access to resources of Myanmar, but not the Western countries. So all the Western powers, from US to Australia, Japan, Canada, and European powers, they were all rushing to Myanmar to re-establish the relations. They were focusing on accessing Myanmar's resources. And also, Myanmar is a key Indo-Pacific power. It's located in the Indo-Pacific. It opens to the Bay of Bengal, right? Which is a key component of the Indo-Pacific. So the Western approach was driven by their motive to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. Right? Western countries were eager to counter Chinese influence, which was rising, which was threatening Western interests across the Indo-Pacific. Right? So these interests, these economic and geopolitical interests, is what led the Western countries to finally recognize the transition, the democratic transition that happened in 2015. Elected government was finally in place, even though military was still pulling the strings. But since the transition had happened, at least elected government was put in place, Western countries finally lifted the economic sanctions and re-established the relations with Myanmar. Now this, in a way, was good news for India, because transition to democracy is always welcome for India, right? That is one common policy that we always have in our foreign policy. We always encourage countries to transition to democracy if they are authoritarian and dictatorial, right? We were forced to deal with Myanmar with the military because out of circumstances, due to national security concerns and China's hostile role, we were forced to deal with the military rule despite all the violations. So this was always a moral dilemma for India, and we constantly had to justify this to Western countries. India was getting caught in between. Western countries would criticize India. European countries and US, for many years they blamed India, criticized India for supporting Myanmar, despite being a democracy ourselves. Finally, when the changes happened, when sanctions were lifted and Western countries themselves established the ties, this pressure on India was lifted. So India was extremely happy, more than happily welcomed these changes, because this would make it easier for India to pave the path for India to more proactively engage with Myanmar. Because in the past, we had pursued many projects. We had pursued many critical projects, strategic connectivity projects, but they were all delayed. Especially the funding would be delayed due to the impact of the sanctions. The Western sanctions would create challenges for Indian investors and companies to invest in these key strategic connectivity projects. So now India was free from that pressure. We no longer had to bother about any Western pressure or sanctions, because sanctions were lifted in 2015 as the country transitioned into a democracy, and Western countries themselves came forward to establish ties with Myanmar. So this was a big positive change. All right. But however, Aung San Suu Kyi could not become the leader of the government. She couldn't become the president. Why? Because in the constitution, Myanmar's military deliberately carried out a change before they gave up power. They introduced a clause that the president should be just a Myanmar national and should not be married to a foreign national. This clause was deliberately added to target Aung San Suu Kyi because she is married to a British national. Her husband is a British citizen. So to target Aung San Suu Kyi and prevent her from becoming the leader, a deliberate provision was added in the constitution to an amendment. Right? This was done before the military gave up power, before the elections. So the idea was to keep out Aung San Suu Kyi because they knew NLD will win. NLD is a very popular party. It was widely expected NLD is going to win the election. So to keep Aung San Suu Kyi out of power, they added this clause that the head of state should not be married to a foreign national. So as a result, Aung San Suu Kyi could not head the government. She could not become the president of the country. However, she took up a nominal role. She became the state councillor, which is a nominal role, something like the president of India, right? But she did have a lot of influence on the NLD because she was the one who built and raised the party, and she remained influential within the party as well. Is that clear? So this status continued until 2020. Until 2020, the situation continued. During this period, there was a fresh wave of crisis, even under a democratic government, right? Even when Aung San Suu Kyi was in a powerful position, right? The country witnessed a massive crisis where a minority group called the Rohingyas, the Rohingya Muslims, were targeted by the army and the radical Buddhists. The radical Buddhists, who have held communal hatred against the Rohingya Muslims from decades, who have oppressed and discriminated the Rohingya Muslims for many decades, they were targeted with the support of the Myanmar army, unleashing a genocide in the region. It triggered a massive refugee crisis. Several Rohingyas were slaughtered. Lakhs of them, they fled the region and sought refuge in neighboring countries. But this crisis was happening. The government, the elected government, didn't do anything. So as a result, the elected government faced a lot of criticism. Aung San Suu Kyi faced a lot of criticism. There was even a call to withdraw her Nobel Peace Prize. But you need to understand why Aung San Suu Kyi couldn't do anything, why the government couldn't do anything. See, democracy had finally come back after a long struggle, right? The military still had a lot of control. If the government does anything wrong, even one step to instigate the military will not hesitate to throw out the democratic government, right? So due to these concerns, NLD, the elected government, and Aung San Suu Kyi, they remained silent. They didn't utter a word on the Rohingya crisis, which was perpetuated by the army and the radical Buddhists. Is that clear? So we will discuss Rohingya crisis separately. I'll come to it at the end. But now let's come to the current situation. Let's see what is the current political status in Myanmar. So in 2020, the term of this government came to an end. Fresh elections were called. Fresh elections were to be held. The 5-year term had ended. So as expected, NLD again won the elections and was about to come back to power. The election results were clearly going in favor of National League for Democracy. The opposition party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which is a proxy of the military, because it mainly consists of former military members, right? This party had lost. People wouldn't vote for this because people of Myanmar have been frustrated with military rule and dictatorship. So NLD has remained popular despite all the criticism, all the challenges, and people voted for Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD, and it was clearly about to win the elections. But before the results could be finalized and announced in February 2021, the military resorted to its usual tactics. Now the military was worried. It was concerned about the growing popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD. The military realized that if democracy continues for one more term, the military might be wiped out. So this led the military of Myanmar to step in again, to intervene again in the electoral process. They raised unsubstantiated allegations of electoral fraud. Without any evidence, they alleged that elections had been rigged, they had been manipulated to favor Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD. These were lies, utter lies, because the elections were monitored and certified by many election agencies from around the world, including our own election commission. When elections happen in a democratic country, foreign election agencies are invited to monitor and certify that it's a free and fair election. So many election agencies and commissions, including the Election Commission of India, they certified that on the ground, the elections appear to be free and fair. Right? The NLD had clearly won a mandate. Aung San Suu Kyi again got the popular support. But the military raised these unnecessary allegations without evidence, saying that elections were rigged, it was manipulated. They said it was a fraud committed by the NLD. By using this fake excuse, they overthrew the government again, and the military declared a national emergency. It overturned the election results. It did not allow NLD to form the government. the election results were nullified and the top leaders were all arrested again. Several cases were filed, many petty cases as well. Like, for example, Aung San Suu Kyi was accused of breaching COVID-19 protocols. For that, she was arrested. She was arrested again for having walkie-talkie handsets, radio sets, right? On such flimsy grounds and charges, she has been arrested. Multiple cases have been filed, including corruption, and many other cases have been filed, leading to her prolonged house arrest again. In the last 3 years, we haven't even seen Aung San Suu Kyi. She's been placed under house arrest, delivered punishments after punishments, and the government was thrown out, and military captured power again in 2021. So it's almost been 2.5 years since this happened, and the military rule continues even today. The Janta rule continues to this day. All right. So what happened was that as soon as the national emergency was declared and the military captured power again, it was immediately resisted by the people and the political parties. Several ethnic groups that oppose the military, opposition political parties, pro-democratic parties, and the civilians, they all united to launch massive pro-democracy protests against the military rule. Because the people of Myanmar are frustrated with military dictatorship. The country is lagging behind. They don't have basic development in the country. There is large-scale violence and destabilization, whereas the military leaders remain rich and powerful. So all the opposition leaders and various political and democratic parties, along with ethnic groups and insurgent groups, they all united with the civilians. They led mass protests to fight for democracy, to restore democracy in the country. But as you can expect, the military has crushed the rebellion. It has used massive force, and it has already killed hundreds and hundreds of civilian protesters. At least 1,000 to 2,500 civilians have been slaughtered. That's the minimum number, right? These many innocent civilians have been killed in the last 2.5 years. It has carried out a mass crackdown. It has opened fire against civilian protesters without any hesitation. It has even used heavy weaponry like airstrikes, battle tanks, and artillery guns to target the pro-democracy movement. Is that clear? So that is the disastrous situation that Myanmar has gotten into again. And it's all thanks to the military dictatorship of Myanmar. They've used Russian fighter jets. Myanmar's Air Force also has Russian fighter jets like the Sukhoi 30, MiG-27, etc. And have conducted airstrikes to bomb the areas that are held by the opposition leaders. All the opposition elements, they have come together to form a national unity government. They have created a parallel government. They even hold some territories as well. They hold some areas as well. Right? They've got the support of some insurgent groups, along with political parties and civilians. They've all united together. So they formed this parallel national unity government, and they hold some territory as well today. So to target them, Myanmar's military has carried out mass crackdowns, opening deliberate fire on civilians. It has used heavy weapons, even conducting airstrikes. Hundreds of people have been killed in single airstrikes. Battle tanks and heavy artillery is being fired upon. Is that clear? So that is the grave situation that has developed in the country. In fact, one of these airstrikes landed on the Indian side. One of the missiles fired by a fighter jet, right? It crossed the border and landed on the Indian side. It landed on the Indian side, leading to a diplomatic issue between India and Myanmar. Fortunately, no one was hurt or injured, but you can understand the spillover effect that such conflicts can have. Is that clear? So this instability in the region has definitely had an impact on India. So as this crisis unfolded in 2021, it triggered a major refugee crisis. Political refugees who feared that they will be targeted by the military, they all fled the country and they moved across the border into India to seek shelter in Manipur and Mizoram. Because this is where they have connections. They have familial support and cultural connections. As Kukis are connected with the Chin and the Zom community. Mizos are connected with the Chin community. So these native groups, along with few political leaders and former government and police officials, they fear being targeted by the military. So they've all moved out of Myanmar and come to India as refugees and sought asylum in India. So many of them are sheltered in Manipur and Mizoram. We don't have accurate numbers on this, but at least a few thousand refugees have come and have been settled in Manipur and Mizoram. The state governments welcome them because they have a connection with these communities. The tribal groups, they have a connection with these communities and they have been welcomed and settled. But as you know, the Kuki Zone community has been involved in violent clashes with Meitei insurgents. The refugee crisis has a role to play in the current crisis of Manipur. The ethnic violence that you are witnessing from the last 3-4 months, right? It's connected to what has happened in Myanmar. The allegation is that the Meiteis have alleged that the Kuki zones who have come to Manipur, they are encroaching forest land and growing drugs. The Kuki zones have denied this allegation. They're saying that the refugees are simply settling down. They've cleared some forests just to settle down because they have no other place to go. So these divides, along with the demand for the tribal status by the Meiteis, triggered massive violence where Meiteis unleashed massive violence against the Kukis. Kukis also have retaliated with counter-violence, leading to complete destabilization of Manipur. And there's every possibility of insurgency raging back in Manipur. See, Manipur has suffered from deadly insurgency from 1960s to 1990s. This was the most violent period in Manipur's history. The insurgency was mainly between Meiteis and Nagas, Meiteis and Kukis. It's a result of ethnic violence and ethnic divisions. Meiteis and Nagas have targeted each other. Meiteis and Kukis have targeted each other. But over the years, India had tackled the threat. The insurgency had gone down, right? Due to better counterinsurgency operations, better development, we had managed to subside the insurgent movements. But now the wounds have been reopened. On one hand, there is a ST issue, the scheduled tribe status issue. Because Meiteis are demanding ST status, even though they are in majority. Only Kukis and Nagas have the ST status in Manipur because they're in minority, they're hill-dwelling tribes. Nagas are found in the hill areas. Kukis are found in the hill areas of Manipur. Whereas Meiteis are in the valley, in the Imphal valley. So Meiteis have been fighting for ST status, and recently there was a court order asking the government to work on this proposal to provide ST status to Meiteis. So this triggered protests by the Kukis, who believe that Meiteis should not get ST status as that could affect the rights of the Kukis. It will allow Meiteis to purchase tribal land in the hill areas. That will threaten tribal rights. So as Kukis protested, right, Meiteis were alleging that Kukis and Zone community were working together to breed terrorism and crime, including drug production, drug trafficking in the state. They alleged that the Chin Zone refugees who had come, who were connected to the Kukis, they were deforesting the areas to grow drugs. Based on these allegations, security operations were carried out by the Manipur government, by the Manipur police. So all these events triggered tensions and led to the breakout of violent clashes between the two sides, which has completely destabilized Manipur. So the refugee crisis in Myanmar has had a direct bearing on India. Now we are staring at a possibility where insurgency in Manipur might come back. We might see a complete revival of insurgency because the armed groups of Kuki and Meitei community are again becoming notorious and dangerous. It's like we're looking back at the 70s and 80s when Manipur was very, very destabilized, right? So these armed groups which have again come up, which have grown in strength, and now that the hatred and the divisions have gone up, that could become a root cause for a complete revival of insurgency in Manipur. And if it were to happen, there will be a direct link, direct connection with what happened in Myanmar. Right? The political crisis, the refugee inflow is connected to the problem, the ethnic problems in Manipur. Is that clear? So this is what you should understand about the entire political history of Myanmar. So with this, we complete the majority of this topic. So now I think we can take a short break. We'll come back in 15 minutes and then we will wrap up this chapter. We're going to discuss the major initiatives that India has towards Myanmar. I'll be taking you through some important connectivity projects which are very important for your prelims and mains. Okay, all these connectivity projects will be very important. We'll understand China's role and China's influence and how India is trying to deal with the Chinese influence. We'll deal with defense border security issues and finally end the discussion by talking about the Rohingya crisis and the cultural relations. So these are the few remaining topics. Let's pick it up after the break. So take a 15 minutes break. It's 7:35. Let's come back at 7:50 a.m. All right. So see you in 15 minutes. Hello everyone, welcome back to the session. Now let's talk about the major policy initiatives towards Myanmar that have been launched by the Modi government. There are 5 major policies that we are pursuing towards Myanmar. One, of course, is the Act East policy of India. As we discussed, Myanmar is like a land bridge. It's a gateway for us to connect with Southeast Asia. The focus of the Look East Act East policy has always been to improve India's relations with Southeast Asia and East Asia. So Myanmar occupies a very, very important place in our Look East Act East policy. If we have to connect better with Southeast Asian markets, if we have to drive development to Northeast India, Myanmar will be very, very critical. Correct? Myanmar is also blessed with resources. It is also a key member of the ASEAN group, which is a regional grouping of the Southeast Asian countries. So India has been pursuing close ties with Myanmar as part of the Act East policy as well. In fact, when the Look East policy was upgraded to the Act East policy in 2014, India made this announcement when Prime Minister Modi was in Myanmar participating in the ASEAN summit. Now, this was a symbolic gesture by India. When Prime Minister Modi made the announcement that we are upgrading Look East policy to Act East policy, we chose to announce this when the PM was on Myanmar soil. Right? Myanmar was hosting that year's ASEAN and East Asia summit, and the India-ASEAN summit was also taking place. So PM Modi was participating at the summit, announced the upgradation of Look East to Act East. Now, this signifies that we give a lot of priority to Myanmar under the Act East policy, because we are looking at Myanmar as a bridge, as a connection to Southeast Asia. That was a symbolic message being sent out by India when we made the announcement in Myanmar itself. Right? In diplomacy, symbolism holds a lot of value. The symbolic gestures you make, right? The symbolic messages you send out hold a lot of value in diplomacy. Countries look for those signs. So when India announced the upgradation of Look East to Act East, it was when Prime Minister Modi was in Myanmar participating in the ASEAN summit. So the message was very simple, that Myanmar is vital for India. It's crucial for India to link with Southeast Asia, to get closer to ASEAN countries, to connect with Southeast Asia. Myanmar is the link for India. That was the message that India was sending out. Other than that, the neighborhood first policy, which we had studied previously, also will apply for Myanmar. As a neighboring country, Myanmar would also benefit from India's neighborhood first policy. Right? This was again launched by Prime Minister Modi in 2014 when he came to power. During his swearing-in ceremony, right, he had invited all the SAARC leaders and he announced the launch of neighborhood first policy, where India would prioritize its relations with the neighboring countries. So Myanmar, being an immediate neighbor, benefits from the neighborhood first policy of India. So in fact, Myanmar is the only country where both neighborhood first and Act East policy both will apply. Since it's an immediate neighbor of India, neighborhood first policy will apply. And as it is a Southeast Asian country, the Act East policy shall also apply to Myanmar. So these are the 2 major policy initiatives that drives India's relations with Myanmar. Then we also have the Buddhist Circuit Initiative that promotes cultural diplomacy. Right? We've studied the Buddhist Circuit Initiative in previous classes under Nepal and Bhutan. I've explained what is the Buddhist Circuit Initiative. We are improving the infrastructure and tourist facilities at all Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India to leverage our Buddhist heritage and to project our Buddhist influence in all the Asian countries where Buddhism is widely popular. Right? From Japan to China, from Sri Lanka to Myanmar. Right? There are many Asian countries where Buddhism is a popular religion, and in some countries it's a majority religion. Right? Myanmar, as we studied earlier, is a Buddhist majority nation. So we want to drive tourism and close people-to-people relations by promoting the Buddhist Circuit Initiative. And Myanmar is a focus country as well under the Buddhist Circuit Initiative. Apart from this, we have greater focus on connectivity. Ever since the Look East policy was launched in 1991 by the then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, since then India has prioritized connectivity with Southeast Asia. Because if you look at the map, you realize that Southeast Asia is the extended neighborhood of India. Right? These Southeast Asian countries are present right next to our immediate neighborhood. So under the Look East and now under the Act East, one focus has been on connectivity, improving land-based connectivity through roads and highways. We're also considering railway connectivity as well. And we're also focused on improving maritime and air connectivity. So Myanmar becomes a very key country because of its location. And we are continuing this approach under the Act East. So there are some major connectivity projects we are pursuing, and we are going to study that very soon. Right? After this, we'll be talking about the connectivity projects. I'll explain the importance of all these projects. The other focus, the policy focus, is on border security, to deal with organized crime, then to counter insurgency and terrorism. This has been a priority for India, and we need the help and support of Myanmar to tackle these threats. That's the reason why we are pursuing this realistic policy, ignoring all the violations that are happening inside the country, and still building good strategic ties, because we need the help of Myanmar's government. Doesn't matter who's in power, we need their support to strengthen border security. So these are the 5 priority policies of India which applies to Myanmar. Now, based on this, let's take a look at all the connectivity projects, and after that, we'll study the India-China competition, how we compete for influence in Myanmar, and we'll also look at the border security and defense relations between India and Myanmar. With regard to connectivity projects, the first project is the IMT Trilateral Highway. The IMT Trilateral Highway. It stands for India, Myanmar, Thailand Trilateral Highway. This is essentially a road project that was proposed in the 1990s. It was proposed under the Look East policy. All the 3 countries are very eager to establish this highway link that will connect India closely with these 2 Southeast Asian countries. So Northeast India will get closer to Myanmar and Thailand, thus linking the markets and creating economic opportunities for both the sides. So from a prelims point of view, these projects become very, very important. You should be familiar with the alignment, the route of these projects, because you can expect map-based questions in your prelims. Even for your means, citing the example of these connectivity projects will help you highlight the close relations that India and Myanmar have. So please look at the map. The IMT highway connects Moreh, which is a border town in Manipur. It's a very important commercial town. It's a trading center. This is where you find a strong Tamil community as well. They trade between Northeast India and Myanmar. All right. So from Moreh, which is right along the India-Myanmar border, the highway will extend inside Myanmar to connect with the major cities of Myanmar, that is Mandalay and Yangon. From here, the highway will move towards Thailand to connect with Mesot. These are the 3 places, the three important locations being connected with Moreh. The whole focus here is to improve cross-border trade, promote the movement of vehicles, especially trucks. They're also contemplating a motor vehicles agreement to allow the free movement of vehicles between these countries. It will promote the movement of people, right? The locals can move around, which will benefit the local economy. It will benefit the border trade between the two sides. It will also promote the cultural ties, the people-to-people relations. It will promote the people-to-people relations. Since communities on both the sides are connected, right? Many ethnic groups have historical, cultural, familial connections. It helps them to connect better and drive the cultural ties as well. It will benefit tourism, right? If you have a land route to Myanmar and Thailand, it could drive tourism from both the sides. So this could be a blessing for border trade opportunities and as well as the economic relations between the two countries, and could drive investments as well into the Northeast region. In fact, the goods of Northeast, the products, can find markets in Southeast Asia through this highway. So that is the reason why the IMT Trilateral Highway is a very important project. But however, unfortunately, the project has faced a lot of delays. The project is still pending, it's still not completed. It's only partially built. Some sections of the highway has been completed, but the project has hit many delays due to financial issues and also due to the political problems and the security situation in Myanmar. Is that clear? So this is where India is finding it to be challenging when it comes to such connectivity projects. That is why we want to ensure political stability and social stability in Myanmar. Without stability, these projects cannot succeed. India has found it difficult to finance the project because of the sanctions. Because again, Western sanctions are back since 2021, since the military took over again and toppled the elected government. Western countries have cut off their ties and have brought back economic sanctions. So over the last 15 years, we have struggled to fund the project because of Western sanctions. Our companies, our banks, they find it difficult to move the money and channel the money to Myanmar because they will feel the impact of Western economic sanctions. Apart from that, the political crisis, the security situation, and the constant violence and turbulence in Myanmar, this has disrupted the IMT Highway project. It is nearing completion, but these issues have delayed the project for many, many years. But if completed, it has great potential to transform the region itself because it will connect South Asia with Southeast Asia. Don't forget that point. It not only connects India with Southeast Asia, but it's a connection between South Asia and Southeast Asia, right? In fact, India has a proposal to extend this highway in the future to Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. There's a proposal from the Indian side under Look East Act East policy to extend this highway all the way to Vietnam, covering these Mekong countries. These countries are the Mekong countries. They're part of the Mekong River Delta. So Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, and Vietnam, right? The CLMVT countries. C for Cambodia, L for Laos, M for Myanmar, V for Vietnam, and T for Thailand. We abbreviate that as CLMVT. These countries are part of the Mekong region, the Mekong River Delta. And we want closer relations with all these countries, especially Vietnam is a strategic partner for India. We have very close defense and security relations with Vietnam. So this will allow India to directly access South China Sea as well and counter Chinese influence in its own backyard. If China can meddle in the Indian Ocean, which is India's backyard, and counter Indian influence, similarly, India has ambition to counter Chinese influence in its own backyard by reaching out to South China Sea. If this highway is realized, if IMT highway is completed, and then if it is extended till Vietnam, right, that will give us direct access to South China Sea, where we can counter the Chinese influence. There is also a proposal for a parallel railway link to connect Delhi with Hanoi. Parallel to this road, we are proposing a railway line as well that will pass from India to Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Right? The Delhi-Hanoi link. Hanoi is Vietnam's capital, and Delhi is, of course, India's capital. So these are some mega projects that have been conceptualized, but the projects are yet to start. The extension has not started. Railway line also has not started. These are simply proposals which are there on paper. IMT highway project has started. Right? It's nearing completion, but it has faced many delays and it is still pending. Right? The main problem is in Myanmar. Moving the money, financing the project has become a challenge. Constructing the road has become a challenge. The political and security crisis and the constant violence in the region is derailing these initiatives. Apart from these road and rail projects, we have a maritime link project as well. That is the Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Corridor. This is one of the most important regional connectivity projects that India has taken up. The Kaladan project. As the name itself tells you, it's a multimodal transit transport corridor, meaning it involves multiple modes of transportation. It has a maritime link to Bay of Bengal. There is a sea-based link to Bay of Bengal. There is a inland navigation route on Kaladan River in Myanmar. Through the Kaladan River, inland navigation route is being created. And there is a highway as well, a road-based connectivity as well. So it's a combination of three different modes of transportation. Through the sea, through a river, and then through a road. That's why it's called multimodal transit transport corridor. So this project again was proposed under the Look East policy. It was proposed in the 1990s. All right. The plan is to link the Indian port at Kolkata Haldia to create a direct sea link from Kolkata port to the strategic Sittwe port that you can see here in the map. The Sittwe port of Myanmar is a strategic port. It opens to the Bay of Bengal and it has been built by India. India has financed the construction of the Sittwe port and it's operated by an Indian company. Recently, this maritime link was opened. Just a few months ago, the sea route of Kaladan, has opened for operations. Please remember this point. Very, very important. The Sittwe port, built by India, operated by an Indian company, has been recently inaugurated. All right, so this part of the link has been completed and we have set up this maritime link. But from here, we are facing a challenge because the Sittwe port and Kaladan River that you see here, they are located in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. This is the Rakhine state of Myanmar. This is where a lot of violence has been witnessed over many years. This is where the Rohingya community can be found, the Rohingya Muslim minorities, who have been targeted and oppressed by Myanmar's army and the radical Buddhists. So because of constant violence in the region, it's been very challenging for India to proceed with the project. Now, since the political crisis also has started, there have been large-scale protests and violent events across this region. Plus, the economic sanctions are back. So it's becoming difficult for India to execute and complete this project. The plan involves an inland navigation route of around 158 kilometers through Kaladan River. Kaladan is actually a transboundary river. It flows down from Mizoram towards Myanmar. So after this inland route on Kaladan River, a highway is being built that will directly connect this river route, with the Indian state of Mizoram in the northeast. So this will create an alternate access to northeast India. We don't have to rely just on Siliguri corridor. Sending goods from the rest of India to Mizoram and Manipur is more challenging to Siliguri corridor. It's a longer route and more difficult route. If this route becomes operational, right, we'll get alternate access to Mizoram and it will improve the opportunities for northeast India. Right? Plus, we already have other connectivity projects that we are pursuing with Bangladesh. In the previous chapter, we studied the road, rail, and waterway projects of India-Bangladesh, through which we are creating alternate routes to northeast India. So this would be an addition to that. This would be to Myanmar. It would improve our trade relations with Myanmar and give us alternate access to the northeast region. But the highway project here from Mizoram to Myanmar also has faced challenges because it has been targeted by insurgents. Along the Mizoram-Myanmar border over here, there are a few armed insurgent groups and criminal groups that operate. They have targeted the project and they have tried to derail the project. So the security situation also has hampered the project. So that is why the project has been delayed. Is that clear? There have been funding issues because of the sanctions, because of the impact of the sanctions and the violence in Rakhine state and the threat of insurgents and criminals along the border. These issues have affected the project, and as a result, the project has slowed down. Even today, the project is not complete. It's been more than 2 decades since the project was taken up and proposed, right? But still, we're not able to complete this due to all these problems associated with Myanmar. But India still has some hope that if things stabilize in Myanmar and if we can push these projects quickly, this will give India a dominant role in Myanmar. The IMT highway, the proposed extension and the parallel railway line, along with the Kaladan project, this could transform our ties not just with Myanmar but with Southeast Asia itself. So we still have hopes, but for that, the situation in Myanmar has to stabilize first. Is that clear? Now, compared to these Indian projects, let us see how China has done. Let us see where China stands as far as investments in Myanmar is concerned. Because since Nepal, Bangladesh, we have been discussing the India-China competition. So let's have the same discussion here as well, because we do face a direct competition with China in Myanmar. As we studied earlier, China is a very close partner to Myanmar. It has been a very good friend, and it's one of the most influential powers in Myanmar. Since many decades, China has been financing Myanmar's military rule. It has very close ties with the communist military dictatorship. It has given a lot of funds and investments. It has supplied weapons, and it holds a lot of influence on Myanmar's military. So Myanmar has joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. As it is a key ally, it has joined the Belt and Road Initiative, or also known as the One Belt, One Road project, OBOR project. So as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, there is one key component, that is the CMEC corridor, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. This is one of the most important corridors of Belt and Road Initiative. For China, this corridor is a top priority. Is that clear? So this corridor, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it seeks to connect the Yunnan province of China with the Rakhine state over here. In fact, China has already made this route operational. It has connected Kunming, which is the capital city of Yunnan province. It has built a series of roads. Railway links also have been established. Pipelines also have been laid, oil pipelines, oil and gas pipelines. It has also invested in power plants and special economic zones. These are the massive projects that China has executed. It has built a road network, a rail network, a pipeline network has been laid. Because in Bay of Bengal, you have hydrocarbon reserves, you have oil and gas reserves. So obviously China is deeply interested to exploit these reserves. So off the coast of Rakhine, China and Myanmar have a joint oil exploration project, and from here, the pipelines are transporting oil and gas directly to China from Bay of Bengal. China has even built a strategic port as part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor called the Kyoukphu port that you see here in the map. Please note down this location. Right next to the Sittwe port of India. Right, we saw the Sittwe port earlier as well as part of Kaladan project. You see the Kaladan project depicted here in orange. This is the Indian project. So as part of Kaladan project, we have developed the Sittwe port. India has funded and constructed the Sittwe port. Right below Sittwe, in Rakhine itself, China also has built a strategic port called the Kyoukphu port. So from here, China has built this connection through roads, railway lines and pipelines and connects that with major cities like Mandalay and Yangon. So this is the corridor that China has created, and this is of great strategic significance to China. The reason why it is so important for China is because this route gives China direct access to the Indian Ocean. China will get direct access to Indian Ocean region through this corridor. China can bypass the Malacca Strait. It can bypass Malacca Strait, which has been a weak point for China. Remember in the first class, I showed you the Malacca Strait near Singapore and Indonesia, right? Roughly located over here. The Malacca Strait has been a weak point for China because Malacca Strait is a choke point. It's a very narrow opening that connects Indian Ocean with the Pacific. It links Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea with Gulf of Thailand and South China Sea. These are important shipping lanes, and China has a lot of dependency on Malacca Strait. Because just like India, even China has a deficit of hydrocarbons. Most of its oil and gas is imported. Right? Just like we depend on West Asian countries for oil and gas supplies, even China depends heavily on West Asian countries for oil and gas supplies. So all these shipments, oil shipments, gas shipments coming from West Asia, they pass through Malacca Strait before reaching China. So China's fear is that the Malacca Strait might be blockaded. There could be a possible naval blockade if there are tensions either with US or India. Because both India and US have the ability to block Malacca Strait if required. Let's say, hypothetically imagine, a war breaks out between India and China. Let's say border dispute escalates between India and China. Or a conflict breaks out between US and China. In such a scenario, both US and India have the ability to block out Malacca Strait to their navies. India has a major naval presence, right? At Andaman Nicobar Islands, we have a tri-service command, where all three services function as a single unified command. And the Navy has established a very strong military presence at Andaman Nicobar. We can easily reach Malacca Strait and block out the entire strait, thus cutting off China from rest of the economy. That will levy a very big economic cost on China. Similarly, the US. US has a major naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Right? I was mentioning the Diego Garcia naval base, if you remember. Right below Maldives, the US has a military base. It's a British territory. Right? So from Diego Garcia, the US can easily deploy its naval vessels and aircraft and block out Malacca Strait and deliver an economic shock to China. So China fears this choke point. It is always believed that this is a weakness. So it has tried gaining direct access to Indian Ocean. One route that provides China direct access to Indian Ocean is the China-Myanmar economic corridor. So through this corridor, it can directly reach Bay of Bengal without depending on Malacca Strait. You can clearly see that in the map. Understood? That is why this project has great strategic significance for China. And also, China has deep interest in Bay of Bengal itself because it wants to monitor India's military activities. In the Bay of Bengal, we have important military installations, right? And China wants to keep an eye on them. In Odisha, in the Balsore district over here, we have the APJ Abdul Kalam Islands, where DRDO has established a missile testing facility. All our ballistic missiles from Prithvi to the entire Agni series, they're all tested here at APJ Abdul Kalam Islands, right? Obviously, China would like to track those activities. Then we have major ports from Kolkata to Visakhapatnam, Chennai, Tuticorin, right? Major seaports of India present. We have important naval bases like Visakhapatnam, Chennai. The Visakhapatnam base is critical because this is where our nuclear submarines are stationed, the Arihant class. The Arihant class nuclear submarines are developed and stationed at Visakhapatnam naval base. Then we have the spaceport of ISRO at Sriharikota. We have nuclear power plants on this coastline at Kudankulam and Kalpakkam. So the whole coastline is strategically vital for India, and China would definitely like to monitor these activities. So having direct access to Bay of Bengal via Myanmar is a strategic advantage to China. Understood? And there is a small island in Bay of Bengal called the Coco Island. Approximately it's over here in this particular location. The Coco Island. The Coco Island was given to Myanmar when we settled the maritime boundary. All right? When India and Myanmar settled the maritime boundary, Coco Island came to Myanmar. It came under Myanmar sovereignty. Because historically, even under colonial rule, Myanmar had control over, that is Burma, had control over Coco Islands. This is right next to Andaman Nicobar Islands of India. Just to the north of Andaman Nicobar, just a few nautical miles away, you have the Coco Island. It's believed that Myanmar has leased the island to Chinese intelligence agencies. Apparently, China has gained access to the Coco Island, and Indian intelligence agencies believe that Chinese intelligence agencies have set up espionage network. They've set up spying equipment to monitor India's activities and intercept India's communications. So there are multiple threats for us in that regard, and this explains why China is so interested in Myanmar, and it explains the importance of the CMEC corridor. Is that clear? So this is the competition we face here. China has very good political ties with the military. It has a lot of influence over them as it funds them, as it gives them weapons as well. And it has made all these big investments. It is setting up power plants, industrial clusters, along with all these infrastructure projects. So that is the competition India faces in Myanmar from China. Now, before I move on, can you guys tell me, is there any other project that China is pursuing to bypass Malacca Strait? Are you aware of any similar project which could be part of Belt and Road Initiative to which China can directly access Indian Ocean without depending on Malacca Strait? If you know that, please let me know in the comments. Very good. Some of you are getting the right answer. Chaitanya, Abhishek, Raghav, Shovik, Pooja, and many others. You guys have given the right answer. Very good. Okay, let me explain this. Apart from CMEC corridor, there's another similar corridor called CPEC corridor with Pakistan. We are going to study this under India, Pakistan, and India, China. In the coming chapters, we are going to talk about the CPEC corridor. This also is part of Belt and Road Initiative. The China-Pakistan economic corridor connects with the Gwadar port, the strategic Gwadar port of Pakistan. It connects China's Xinjiang province through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is Indian territory occupied by Pakistan, and reaches the Gwadar port in Balochistan province of Pakistan. This route as well gives China direct access to Indian Ocean. From Xinjiang, it can directly reach Arabian Sea. Right? China need not depend on Malacca Strait. It can directly take the oil and gas shipments from Persian Gulf, from West Asia, to the Gwadar port. And from there, it can ship this to Xinjiang. This will reduce China's dependency on Malacca Strait. There's one more project that China is pursuing. I'm glad that some of you have mentioned it, because not many of them will be aware of this other project. This is still a proposal, however. Whereas CMEC is completed, CMEC is already operational. Last year, China already started moving goods to China-Myanmar economic corridor. China-Pakistan economic corridor is also progressing very well, and part of it is already functioning. But there is a third project which is still a proposal. There's a proposed project via Thailand. It's called the Kra Canal, which is proposed to be built across the Isthmus of Kra. I hope you know what's isthmus. You would have studied in geography. Just like strait, gulf, bay, you have isthmus as well, right? If a strait is a narrow water channel connecting two large water bodies, then an isthmus is a narrow land corridor that is separating two large water bodies. Now look at the map here. If you see the map, you'll notice that Thailand is becoming very narrow at this point. Thailand is a very narrow country at this point, where it connects with Malaysia and then Singapore, right? So this narrow land corridor of Thailand, it separates the Andaman Sea and Bay of Bengal over here from the Gulf of Thailand and South China Sea on the other side. Since the land is very narrow here, it's hardly a few kilometers wide, you can easily dig the land, cut open the land here across the isthmus and create a canal, a shipping canal, which is the Kra Canal. This isthmus is the Kra Isthmus. All right? Just like you have man-made canals, like Suez Canal, for example, the Panama Canal. Right? They were all created by us, by man. Right? The land was cut open to link two large water bodies. Suez Canal connected the Red Sea with Mediterranean. The Panama connects Atlantic with the Pacific and creates a shorter route. Similarly, China has a grand proposal, a grand strategy. It wants this to be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If Thailand agrees, it wants to build a Kra Canal across the Isthmus of Kra so that the Chinese ships can directly reach Andaman Sea via Gulf of Thailand without passing through Malacca Strait. This is one more proposal, but Thailand is yet to agree. It has shown interest, but it is yet to agree to the project. So you have to be aware of these three Chinese initiatives to directly access Indian Ocean without depending on Malacca Strait. All right, one is the China-Myanmar economic corridor, which is already operational. China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is nearing completion. And the third is the proposed Isthmus Canal, the Kra Canal across Thailand. Understood? Now, let's move on to the last few topics that we are left with. let's take a look at the defense and border security relations. This is another important aspect of India's relations with Myanmar. See, India has given a lot of military support to Myanmar. To gain the friendship of Myanmar's military, we have given them all the support necessary. Along with funds, we have supplied weapons to them. Right? Even when Myanmar was committing violations, human rights violations, India has supplied weapons to the country. So this is a little controversial policy because Western countries criticize India's approach. But as I told you, in geopolitics, sometimes you have to be cold-hearted. Sometimes you have to look after your own self-interest, your national interests, because there's nothing much you can do in other countries. Right? It's not that India can interfere and resolve the crisis in Myanmar. Right? Even if we impose sanctions, join the Western countries and criticize Myanmar, right? It's unlikely that things will change on the ground. So instead, protect your interests at least. That's exactly what we are doing with Russia and Ukraine. Right? And India has done this repeatedly throughout our independent history. Right? We followed independent foreign policy. Right? Our foreign policy has been autonomous, and we always looked after our own interests without worrying about idealism, without trying to please Western countries. Right? We don't fall under the pressure of any country for that matter. So in the case of Myanmar, we have done this quite well, and we have cultivated very close defense and security relations. Because as I explained at the start of the chapter, our primary focus with Myanmar is to tackle the border security threat, to tackle organized crime that emanates from Golden Triangle, to counter insurgency in the northeast, and tackle the safe haven that is present across the border in Myanmar. This is very crucial given the fact that China has been waging a covert proxy war against India by using Myanmar as a base. Via Myanmar, China has extended support to northeast insurgents. It has been doing this since the 1962 war, especially 1960s, 1970s, and 80s. China was giving a lot of support to northeast insurgents in Myanmar. Right? And off late, in the last 20 years as well, India has intelligence to believe that Chinese intelligence agencies are still funding and arming northeast rebels who are hiding in Myanmar. Is that clear? So we conduct two important military exercises. Please remember the name, IMBAX and IMNEX. These are bilateral exercises between our armies and our navies. Is that clear? We have also helped Myanmar in conducting hydrographic survey in the Bay of Bengal. What's a hydrographic survey? Hydrographic survey is an underwater survey. You use sonar technology, right, to map out the terrain of the seafloor. To map the terrain of the seafloor. Because the seafloor is not flat. You have a topography underwater as well, under the seas and the oceans. You have a topography just like on land, right? Your territorial landmass is not flat. You have a topography. You have hills, valleys, mountains, etc. Right? The topography keeps changing. Similarly, under seas and oceans as well, there is a topography that's present. You have trenches, ridges, mountains that are present. It's important to map out the terrain if you have to deploy your naval ships, and especially if you have to deploy your submarines. Naval deployment cannot happen without hydrographic surveys, hydrographic mappings, and India has the technology. The Indian Navy has the required technology to conduct hydrographic mapping, and we offer this as a service to other friendly countries in the region. Not just with Myanmar, we have conducted hydrographic mapping even with Maldives and Sri Lanka. We are helping many friendly countries in the Indian Ocean to map out the terrain of the seafloor, and we share the data with them. It will help both the sides. This also helps in resource exploration. The hydrographic maps, they help in exploiting and exploring the underwater resources, the marine mineral resources. Right? There could be polymetallic nodules, rare earth elements present on the seafloor. So in exploring and exploiting those resources, hydrographic mapping will be helpful. So it serves both an economic purpose and a strategic purpose. So we have conducted a joint hydrographic survey and helped Myanmar in mapping out the terrain of the seafloor in Bay of Bengal, and it helps in our naval deployments, especially to deploy submarines. Now, given that China is increasing its naval deployments, the PLA Navy, the plan, is constantly sending submarines, ships, and spy vessels to Indian Ocean. We have even detected them in Bay of Bengal multiple times. It's important to monitor and track the Chinese activity. In the last 20 years, the plan, the PLA Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, has sent multiple sorties. It has sent multiple naval ships and submarines as well, even nuclear submarines, and as well as spy vessels, which have entered Indian Ocean and Bay of Bengal and have come quite close to Indian waters. Is that clear? So this is something India would like to track and monitor. So that is why our naval cooperation is very important with Myanmar, and we not only conduct a naval exercise, but we have conducted joint hydrographic mapping as well. And the latest development is that recently we have gifted a submarine to Myanmar. India has recently donated INS Sindhuri. It's an old Soviet submarine which was with Indian Navy. Indian Navy was operating it for many years, and it was decommissioned from service. This submarine has been retrofitted. It has been upgraded. It has been serviced by India with Russian help. And then we have gifted this to Myanmar's Navy. It's a kilo-class diesel submarine. Please make a note of this. It's a recent development. Just a couple of years ago, in 2020, India gifted a submarine to Myanmar's Navy. It's a Russian submarine, a kilo-class diesel submarine, which was used by Indian Navy. It's an old one. We decommissioned it, got it serviced and retrofitted and upgraded from Russia, and then gifted this to Myanmar's Navy. So we are engaging in very strong naval diplomacy with Myanmar. Then other than that, we are involved in very close counter-insurgency and counter-terrorist operations. Counter-insurgency and counter-terrorist operations has been a priority. All right. Recently, in 2015, India carried out a cross-border strike. A surgical strike was carried out across the border in Myanmar against the camps of a terror group called NSCN Kaplang faction. NSCN Kaplang is a notorious terrorist organization. It's a northeast outfit. NSCN Kaplang faction is hiding in Myanmar. It has a safe haven there. It gets some support from local Nagas in Myanmar. This group has been a major threat to India. And in 2015, this outfit carried out a terror attack against the Indian Army. Is that clear? So in retaliation, the Indian Army crossed over the border and conducted a surgical strike against the camps of NSCN Kaplang. Now, if you guys have seen the movie Uri, which is based on the surgical strikes India conducted in Pakistan, the movie begins with the opening scene. Right? The movie opens with a scene in the northeast. You see an Indian Army convoy passing near the Myanmar border in Manipur. Right? So this convoy is attacked. It's blown apart by an ambush attack, killing many Indian soldiers. This incident is a real incident. It happened in 2015. This was an attack against Indian Army carried out by NSCN Kaplang. Right? NSCN Kaplang was opposing a peace process that we had started with other Naga insurgent groups. In 2015, India signed a very important framework agreement to take forward the Naga peace process, to bring Naga insurgency to an end. Other Naga insurgent groups like NSCN IM faction, the Isaac Mulva faction, they have surrendered along with some other political groups, the Naga political groups, and they are negotiating with India for a peace accord. This framework agreement to start the peace process was signed in 2015. All right, but the Kaplan faction opposes the peace process. It wants to continue the war against India. It wants to continue the separatist movement against India. So to oppose the peace process which was initiated, this outfit carried out a major attack against Indian army in 2015. In the Chandel Ukrul sector of Manipur, which is right next to Myanmar's border, an Indian army convoy was blown up by NSC and Kaplan terrorists. They came from across the border. Their camps are located in Myanmar. They infiltrated and carried out the attack and they sneaked back into Myanmar. This was one of the biggest losses suffered by the Indian army in the northeast during peacetime. So following this, India retaliated with a surgical strike to punish the Kaplan faction and to eliminate the safe haven for this outfit. The Indian army used its special forces, the para commandos, the para SF, and they were inserted across the border into Myanmar to strike the camps of NSC and Kaplan. Is that clear? It was a very successful operation. And that's exactly what you see in the movie as well, in the movie Uri. These are real incidents that took place in 2015. But such cooperation has existed between India and Myanmar even before, even for many years. Such cross-border operations with friendly countries cannot happen without their knowledge. These are covert operations, classified operations, which is part of your close covert partnership. Right? The surgical strike in Pakistan was different. That's with a hostile country. Right? There, of course, we don't take Pakistan's permission. India would infiltrate and carry out the strikes and come back. But Myanmar is a different case. It's a friendly country. No foreign country will tolerate covert operations on their soil without their permissions. Right? Or rather, publicly, they'll never acknowledge that. So India and Myanmar have a tacit understanding for many years that we allow such cross-border operations along the border. When required, Indian forces have been allowed to operate few kilometers across the border to target northeast insurgents. This is a tacit secret understanding which has existed for many years. But unfortunately, in 2015, after the successful surgical strike, some of the government ministers, they went public with the operation. See, the understanding is that neither side will speak about these operations. They'll never acknowledge that these operations happened. That's the very nature of a covert operation. They're supposed to remain classified. But some of the government ministers, they went public, started claiming credit for the Indian Army's operation. Now, this embarrassed Myanmar. Myanmar was very upset, was angry that India had revealed the operation in public domain because that will bring pressure on Myanmar. Within Myanmar, questions will be raised as to how foreign troops were allowed on their soil to conduct a military strike. Now look at the crisis in India-Canada relations. Right? There's allegation that Indian intelligence carried out an assassination on Canadian soil. Right? So in the world of diplomacy, such operations are not tolerated. With friendly countries, there might be tacit understandings where such operations might be permitted, but the condition is that you maintain secrecy about those projects, about those missions. So India-Myanmar relations were disrupted after the surgical strike because India went public with the operation. Then top Indian officials and leaders visited Myanmar. India's foreign secretary, foreign minister, national security advisor, they visited Myanmar to repair the damage, to repair the relationship. Right? So we do have a close counterinsurgency, counter-terror cooperation where Myanmar has often allowed Indian troops to conduct precision strikes against the terror camps that are located along the border. Is that clear? So we have signed an agreement as well on border cooperation to deal with all the border threats. We share intelligence with each other. India's RAW and IB. They work closely with Myanmar's security agencies and share intelligence. The border guarding force also works closely with their counterparts on the other side. Any idea which is the border guarding force here from India? Which is the border guarding force India has deployed along the Myanmar border? Let's see how many of you can get this right. SSB, BSF, no. ITBP, no, wrong, incorrect. Some of them have got it right. Alenta, Kuraku, Nabin, Kishan, Abhishek, Nitesh. Very good. The correct answer is Assam Rifles. Assam Rifles is the Central Armed Police Force of the Home Ministry, which is the border guarding force along the Myanmar border. Assam Rifles is also involved in counterinsurgency operations along with Indian Army in the northeast. So Assam Rifles is deployed here to secure this porous border where you have multiple threats such as organized crime and infiltration of insurgents and terrorists. So we have very close security cooperation where our intelligence agencies, border guarding forces, and armed forces, they collaborate to tackle insurgency, terrorism, and organized crime. In fact, in 2019, we conducted a series of joint operations called Operation Sunrise 1 and Sunrise 2 to target some of the insurgents operating along the Mizo-Myanmar border who were threatening the Kaladan project. Remember, we just discussed the Kaladan project has been targeted by some insurgent and criminal organizations that operate along Mizoram-Myanmar border. They were responsible for the delay of the road project, which is part of Kaladan initiative. So in 2019, the Indian Army, along with Myanmar's army, conducted a joint operation from both the sides. 2 phases of operations were conducted, called Operation Sunrise 1 and Sunrise 2. It went on for several weeks, where Indian Army and Myanmar's army targeted these insurgent and criminal organizations operating along the Mizoram-Myanmar border. They were seen as a major threat for both the countries. So this is the kind of close security cooperation we have with Myanmar. We have even supplied weapons in the past. Is that clear? We have funded Myanmar's military modernization as well. So that is the defense and security ties we have with Myanmar. So this explains how influential India also is in Myanmar. That's why I told you after China, India is one of the most influential countries. Russia is also very influential, mainly because Russia provides diplomatic and military support. A lot of weapons and defense equipment that Myanmar has, it's of Russian origin. From fighter jets to helicopters to other platforms. Most of them are from Russia. So Russia also is very influential. And India also remains very influential along with China and Russia. Is that clear? So this almost brings my discussion to an end. We have just the last topic. After that, a small mention of cultural ties. And then we can close this chapter for today. Let's discuss the Rohingya crisis in detail. This is another major issue, a major topic, which affects India as well and affects the entire region. So we should understand what is the Rohingya crisis all about. We should know who are the Rohingyas, where are they present, what has happened to them, right? What is the extent of the crisis and how does it impact India? And what has been India's policy with regard to the Rohingya crisis? So there are various points to discuss and cover. Let's cover this in complete detail. So Rohingyas are essentially ethnic Muslim minorities. It's an ethnic Muslim minority group, which historically belongs to the Chittagong, Cox's Bazar area. Historically, Rohingyas are from this region, which is today part of Bangladesh. Let's say you go back 300 years, right, 250 to 300 years back. So then, the Rohingya Muslims were found in the Chittagong, Cox's Bazar area, which I have marked here. Today, these areas are part of Bangladesh, meaning it was part of East Pakistan as well. So when India and Pakistan were created, following independence from British rule, right, Chittagong and Cox's Bazar were part of East Pakistan. After the liberation of Bangladesh, these territories passed on to Bangladesh. All right. So historically, the community is from here, from the Chittagong, Cox's Bazar area. But over a period of time, Rohingyas have migrated. They have moved from Chittagong and Cox's Bazar and they are settled in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. You're already familiar with the Rakhine state because we just studied the Rakhine state, mentioned that as part of the Sittwe Port project of India, which is a key component of the Kaladan project. Right? This is where the India-built Sittwe port is located. This is where the Chinese Kyofu port also is located. Right? China even has oil pipelines. You also have a Chinese port and Chinese pipelines that are part of China-Myanmar economic corridor. That's part of Rakhine state. It passes through Rakhine state. So historically, this community, they migrated mainly due to economic and political reasons, and they settled in the Rakhine state. Now, please understand that Rohingyas were essentially merchants and traders. If you look at the history of Rohingyas, right, since medieval times, Rohingyas have been merchants and traders, and they've been running very successful trading businesses across this region. In the medieval sea links, the maritime links that connected West Asia with Indian subcontinent with Southeast Asia, Rohingya traders and merchants were playing a key role. So since they have been traders and merchants, they've always done well financially. They have been a very well-off community in the past. If you look at them before 1950s, right? So they have been a well-off community. The community has done quite well because they were involved in trading and business. So this region that you're looking at, be it India, East Pakistan or Bangladesh, and then Myanmar, these countries didn't exist when Rohingyas had moved and settled in Rakhine. These nation states were born much later, correct? This entire region was ruled by various kingdoms and empires, including few, even the Mughals had influence in this region. There were few other Muslim kingdoms that ruled the Arakan regions. The Arakan is a mountain range in Myanmar. So across the Arakan and across parts of today's Bangladesh, you had some Muslim kingdoms that had ruled this region. Mughals also had some influence here, right? And later it came under colonial rule. Under the colonial rule, this was part of British India, including Bangladesh and today's India. They were all part of British India. Myanmar was Burma, right? A separate British colony that is Burma. So Rohingyas, who were historically from Chittagong and Cox's Bazar, they had naturally migrated many years ago and settled in the Rakhine state, even before all these countries were born. But once the British left, once they decolonized the region and finally independence was granted, all these new countries were born and these nation states came up. Along with that, the boundaries also came up. So there was India, Burma became Myanmar in 1948, then this became East Pakistan, right, in 1947. In 1971, this would later become Bangladesh. So now, Myanmar, which came under military rule in 1962, was very dependent on support from radical Buddhists. The radical Buddhists of Myanmar have always been a support base for Myanmar's military. All right, they have a dependency on each other. These radical Buddhists, they've always had a historical rivalry with the Rohingya Muslims. It's a communal division. There has been communal polarization. There is a communal angle to this. Because Rohingyas, who were in minority, they were doing financially well, whereas the Buddhists, who were in majority, right, they couldn't get similar opportunities. So this led to jealousy, resentment, hatred, and eventually communal clashes between the radical Buddhists and the Rohingyas. So after Myanmar came under military rule in 1960s, the Myanmar government, the junta, the military junta, started discriminating against Rohingyas in order to please the radical Buddhists. A systematic discrimination and oppression was carried out against Rohingyas starting from 1960s itself. Myanmar brought out few citizenship laws through which Rohingyas were declared as stateless. Their citizenship was taken away. And Myanmar said Rohingyas don't belong to Rakhine. Myanmar said Rohingyas are the responsibility of East Pakistan. Because in 60s it was still East Pakistan. After Bangladesh was born, Myanmar would say that Rohingyas belong to Bangladesh, not to Myanmar. So an entire community was targeted on their religious identity and their citizenship was snatched by the government with the support of the radical majority Buddhists. And this began a series of events that would discriminate, oppress and persecute the Rohingya Muslim minorities. Is that clear? So Myanmar would ask the Rohingyas to go back to Chittagong and Cox's Bazar, to go back to Bangladesh or East Pakistan. So once the citizenship was taken away, they became easy targets. Since they wouldn't have any rights or any protection, radical Buddhists would unleash violence against them, target them on communal lines, leading to frequent communal clashes in the region. Rohingyas would also retaliate. Rohingyas, some of them would become extremists because of the constant cycle of violence and oppression, and even they would retaliate against the radical Buddhists and the Myanmar army and the government. So this destabilized the Rakhine region and multiple rounds of conflicts have taken place in this region. Is that clear? So Rohingyas, who are stateless, even today they don't have citizenship, and they've been mistreated, they've been abused and targeted and persecuted. So over the years, they've moved out of the region in order to save their lives and to lead a better life, and they have sought asylum in neighboring countries. Most Rohingyas have gone back to Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. They have moved across the land maritime border here. Some take the land route, some take the risky sea route through Bay of Bengal. And they reach Bangladesh. They reach Chittagong and Cox's Bazar and they have sought refuge in Bangladesh. Some of the Rohingyas, during peak periods of violence, they have crossed into India as well, seeking refuge in India. Many others have taken the risky sea route to Malaysia and Thailand, hoping they will get refuge in those Southeast Asian countries. So even Malaysia and Thailand have received Rohingya refugees over the last many years. Is that clear? So this issue has been persisting from 1960s till date. There have been multiple rounds of violence. There has been repeated discrimination against the community. This is targeted discrimination. And they have been oppressed through the policies of Myanmar. So this has given rise to a humanitarian crisis in the region. And recently the crisis exploded again. In 2012, 2016 and 2017, there were multiple rounds of communal and targeted violence against Rohingyas. Is that clear? Large-scale violence was unleashed recently, just a few years ago, that triggered a massive refugee crisis where lakhs of Rohingyas fled the region. The radical Buddhists, they targeted the Rohingyas again. Communal riots broke out between them. All right? And some of the radical Rohingyas, right, who see that they should take revenge against the Buddhists and the Myanmar government because of the atrocities they have committed. Some of these radicals have set up a terror outfit called ARSA. They have set up a terrorist organization to counter the radical Buddhists and Myanmar's army and government and to protect the Rohingya community. And they have taken up terrorism and they justify terrorism and violence in the name of self-protection. some of these extremists, they have this terror outfit called ARSA, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. Is that clear? This terror outfit started attacking the Buddhists. It carried out attacks at Buddhist temples. It attacked the Myanmar army as well in 2015-2016. Following these terror attacks, Myanmar army used this as an excuse, and it launched a major counter-terror operation in Rakhine. And in the name of counter-terrorist operation, in the name of targeting ARSA, the army committed a brutal atrocity, which is even labeled as a genocide against the Rohingyas. Lakhs of Rohingyas were killed and slaughtered in these so-called counter-terror operations. Many villages were targeted, right? Even women, children were not spared, and this violence went on for several weeks. The region was cut off for foreign media, so that no one can report about it. But satellite images have shown the scale of damage and destruction that Myanmar's army and radical Buddhists have caused in the Rohingya inhabited region. So the remaining Rohingyas, they fled for their lives, and there was a mass refugee movement where lakhs of Rohingyas, they fled from here. They tried going to Bangladesh, India, Thailand, and Malaysia again. So this is what sparked the latest crisis that we saw in 2016-2017. So this is nothing short of a humanitarian crisis created by Myanmar. It has been aggravated by some of the Rohingya extremists. But the primary blame lies with the radical Buddhists and Myanmar army who have committed these atrocities against innocent Rohingyas as well. Right? They haven't spared civilians and innocents as well. Right? ARSA is a reaction to the atrocities that the Buddhists and the army have committed. Of course, nothing justifies violence or terrorism, but still, the ARSA and its activities has invited a ruthless retaliation from the army, leading to the persecution of the community. Right? So many global organizations, they were very concerned about this crisis that happened, and they even called the Rohingyas the most persecuted community in the world. The United Nations, then human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. These are major human rights organizations. These are global NGOs. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They're global NGOs that work in the field of human rights. So along with these global human rights organizations, even the UN has called Rohingyas the most persecuted community in the world. Because Rohingyas have been at the receiving end for almost 5 to 6 decades. First, their citizenship was snatched away. They were made stateless. They were pushed out of the region. Right? Targeted violence was committed. And this continues till date. And some of the Rohingya extremists have taken up terrorism as well, increasing the complexity and the violence in the region. So this presents a major crisis and a challenge for the neighboring countries. Now, India has received around 40,000 refugees. Around 40,000 Rohingyas have entered India between 1960s and 2015. This is according to the Ministry of Home Affairs. The MHA has said that in the past, that is before the 2016 crisis, we have received around 40,000 Rohingyas in total. Some of them have come through the northeast route, some have taken the sea route as well, and they are settled in the northeast region. Some have reached Jammu and Kashmir. Some are settled in Delhi. There are Rohingya camps and slums that have come up. They come to Delhi because they want to reach the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to get a refugee card from the UN so that they get some basic benefits. And some of them are also found in Hyderabad. These are the places where, according to the Indian government, Rohingya refugees have settled. And these are the refugees who came in the past, before 2016. All right? So India's policy was that we will not accept refugees officially. We never accepted Rohingyas as refugees. Even now, we haven't given them refugee status. But at the same time, we were not hostile to them either. Given the grave humanitarian crisis they were facing, right? India understood the situation. So what the previous governments did was, we didn't reject them. We didn't block their entry. We weren't hostile to them. At the same time, we didn't officially accept them as well. We didn't give them official refugee status. So if someone managed to enter, we would allow them to settle until they can get the UN refugee status at New Delhi. There will be the UN High Commissioner's Office for Refugees. They will reach out and appeal to get them a refugee card, and that will give them basic rights and entitlements. This had been the previous policy of India. Right? This was primarily on humanitarian grounds. It was a humanitarian crisis. Because India has a rich history and tradition of standing up for refugees in the region. First, we accepted Tibetan refugees. When China crushed the uprising in Tibet in 1959, we took in lakhs of Tibetan refugees along with the Dalai Lama, the figurehead of Tibetan Buddhism. Right? We have settled the Tibetan refugees in India, even allowed them to run a parallel government in exile in Dharamshala. We have taken Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka, when Sinhala Buddhists targeted the Tamil minorities. Right? We have settled the refugees, the Tamil refugees in India. We took Bengali refugees when Pakistan oppressed and targeted them and committed a genocide against them in East Pakistan. We studied that under the previous chapter. We have taken Afghan refugees as well. Right? So India has a history of accepting refugees on a case-to-case basis, and we have done this on humanitarian grounds. But this time, in 2016, the Modi government reversed this policy and adopted a hostile approach to Rohingya refugees. When the latest crisis happened, when the Myanmar army launched this so-called counter-terrorist operation against ARSA, and in the name of targeting ARSA terrorists, the army attacked entire villages, killing civilians as well. That is what sparked the latest crisis, triggering lakhs of refugees to move out. So at this point, when Bangladesh was receiving thousands of refugees, they were trying to enter India as well. The Modi government said that India is not going to accept Rohingyas. We are not going to accept them. We are going to block their entry. And we also said that we'll identify the existing refugees and we will deport them back to their country. This was the stated policy of the Modi government. It was a reversal of the previous position. Now this created a big controversy, right? And there are two sides to this argument. This hostile approach of India was heavily criticized by the UN and global human rights organizations as it was placing the Rohingya refugees at risk. It was criticized even by the Supreme Court, the National Human Rights Commission, and by several activists in the country as well. Is that clear? But the Modi government justified the policy. And on the other side, there was a lot of criticism against this policy. So let's examine this. Let's look at both sides of the argument for having a balanced debate. See, there was a case filed at the Supreme Court after India blocked the entry of Rohingyas. India said we're not going to allow them to enter as well. Previously, we weren't doing that. Even though we didn't accept them and give them refugee status before, we weren't blocking their entry, right? We weren't hostile to them because we knew what situation they were coming from, right? It was a humanitarian obligation to just allow them to enter the country to save their lives. Because please understand, refugees are coming to save their lives. They have no other option. If they stay back, they'll be killed, they'll be slaughtered. All right, they're not illegal migrants. Illegal migrants are different. illegal migrants we have got from Bangladesh, they are coming for a better life, a better job, a better livelihood. There's no threat to their life. They're entering the country illegally, correct? Whereas refugees are running away from a conflict. They're running away from persecution. They're trying to save their lives. That's why they seek asylum in another country. So there is a set of international law that governs this particular space. So we need to examine what is the international law telling about refugees, what is India's policy, and whether India is correct or wrong. Was this policy correct or wrong? Right? That's what we should examine. See, India stated that in front of the Supreme Court, the Modi government submitted, because a case had been filed when India adopted the hostile approach. Few activists, they filed a case in the Supreme Court challenging this policy of the government of India. When the Supreme Court questioned as to why you are blocking Rohingyas. Previously, we haven't done that. You already have 40,000 refugees. You're accepting that. So now, why are you blocking them? What's the reason? This question was raised with the Supreme Court. The Modi government said, Rohingyas are a security threat. The Rohingyas are a security threat, and hence we are blocking their entry. To this, the Supreme Court asked, what kind of security threat are we facing? The government pointed out that ARSA is a threat to India. And this is a correct argument. ARSA is definitely a threat because it has connections with Lashkar-e-Toiba and ISI, and even with Al-Qaeda. There are proven links between ARSA and Pakistan's ISI and Lashkar-e-Toiba and Al-Qaeda as well. Plus, ARSA will have a motivation to attack India. It has tried attacking India. Why would ARSA attack India? There are three reasons. India is the birthplace of Buddhism. There are many Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India. ARSA's target is Buddhists because radical Buddhists have committed atrocities against Rohingyas. Right? So they seek revenge against Buddhists. They target Buddhist pilgrimage sites. In fact, they've tried attacking Bodh Gaya in Bihar. They tried, but they failed. It was a failed attack. Apart from India being home to Buddhist pilgrimage sites and being the birthplace of Buddhism, we have never criticized Myanmar's army. We have supported Myanmar's army during all the violence which was being carried out, and we have given weapons as well and support to them. Upon that, the third reason, we adopted a hostile policy blocking Rohingyas and saying that we'll identify the existing ones and we'll deport them back. So all these reasons, they are enough for ARSA to attack India. Right? One, because of Buddhist sites in India, India being the birthplace of Buddhism. Second, our close ties with Myanmar's army. We have never criticized the army, never supported Rohingyas before openly. Right? That's been our policy, to have good ties with Myanmar at any cost. And next is the hostile approach that was taken. These are enough reasons and motivations for ARSA to attack India. That's a real threat. There are intelligence inputs that suggest ARSA does represent a threat to India. The Supreme Court agreed. Okay, ARSA is a threat. But how can you say the whole Rohingya community is a threat? This was the question, the critical question raised with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was furious at this argument because you can't label an entire community as a security threat. This is against our constitutional principles. Is that clear? The Supreme Court accepted that ARSA is a terrorist group. It is a terrorist organization, there is no doubt. So deal with ARSA, tackle them. You have your security forces, you have your intelligence agencies. Deal with the security threat. But you can't label an entire community which is fleeing a conflict, asking for asylum as a security threat. Right? You can't stereotype the whole community as a security threat. So this was a criticism from the Supreme Court. Even the National Human Rights Commission had raised questions about this. But of course, they wouldn't intervene. It's a foreign policy matter. It wouldn't be right for the court to interfere. That would upset our ties with friendly countries. So the Supreme Court didn't really intervene, but the government continued with this policy and approach. But we did face a lot of international criticism from the UN and other global human rights organizations. To this criticism, the Modi government said that, see, we have no obligations under international law. India said we are not obligated to take refugees. We are not party to the Refugee Convention. We are not party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. We have not signed the 1967 Additional Protocol to the Refugee Convention. So as a result, India has no obligations to take refugees. This was the argument of the government of India. This is a valid argument again, because that's true. We haven't signed the 1951 Refugee Convention. India is not party to it. We haven't signed the 1967 Additional Protocol to the Refugee Convention. So as a result, there is no direct international obligation on India to take refugees. Is that clear? Now, why hasn't India signed the Refugee Convention and the Additional Protocol? That's another story altogether. Because this Refugee Convention was introduced after the Second World War to deal with European refugees alone. It was brought out in the European context to deal with refugees of the World War. This would never apply for countries like India. The challenge is, if you sign the convention, you're going to take some obligations. You have to provide some basic rights to refugees. And it also places certain duties on refugees on how they should behave. Because see, taking in refugees, on one hand, is a humanitarian commitment. On humanitarian grounds, you're trying to save lives. Because these are people who are running away to save their lives from conflict zones. On the other hand, taking refugees beyond your capacity will become an economic and social burden. We mentioned and studied this under Bangladesh as well, when we discussed liberation of Bangladesh war and the genocide against Bengalis. Right? We spoke about the 10 million Bengali refugees received by India. We took them in on humanitarian grounds, but dealing with them, taking care of them, giving them basic necessities became an economic challenge for India. Right? It became a burden on India. It leads to social consequences as well. So India didn't want to take up this burden as an obligation because the convention was more suited in the European context. Right? Initially, that was the case. Later, the Refugee Convention was expanded to cover the whole world, to cover all countries, all refugees, to the Additional Protocol, the 1967 Additional Protocol. But still, India took a call that we shouldn't sign this because we shouldn't be under any obligations to take refugees and provide basic rights to them. India has left this to the discretion of the government. We decide this on a case-to-case basis. Because even without any such international obligation, we have already taken the right stand. We have taken multiple refugees, as I explained. Right? Even without being part of these conventions, we have taken Tibetan refugees, Tamil refugees, Bengali refugees, Afghan refugees. We have dealt with it on a case-to-case basis. This has always been India's approach. Whenever the crisis comes up, whenever there is a refugee flow, we'll decide the policy on a case-to-case basis. That has been the approach of India. We didn't want to sign the Refugee Convention as it was largely meant for the European context to deal with World War II refugees. Plus, India realized we are in a difficult neighborhood. Right? We're in South Asia, where all our neighbors are destabilized. Every crisis will push refugees into India. And tomorrow, if you sign the convention, right, even though it was later expanded to cover all countries through Additional Protocol of 1967, problem is if you sign these two agreements, it will become an obligation on India to take all refugees. Tomorrow, there might be a crisis in Pakistan. Refugees might flow into India. There might be a crisis in Bangladesh or Myanmar or Sri Lanka. We are located in a difficult neighborhood in South Asia. So realizing that, previous governments never signed these conventions. That's India's policy even today. We haven't signed the 51 Refugee Convention, the 67 Additional Protocol. Because we don't want this as an international commitment. then you're bound. You can't say no to it. You have to be okay with accepting refugees. So to give flexibility, India decides on its own on a case-to-case basis, and we have done well. We've taken refugees whenever the crisis has come, but on our own terms, instead of being obligated by these conventions. All right. So in this regard, the Modi government is not wrong. We don't have international obligations here. We are not party to refugee convention and additional protocol to the refugee convention. But however, the other argument is that India does have an obligation to the UN Charter, to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and to our own constitution. This provides a legal basis for India to accept refugees. Taking refugees is a humanitarian obligation. It's seen as part of customary law as well. The UN Charter commits all UN members to act on humanitarian grounds to help people who are facing crisis situations. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we have signed it, we are party to it, we have ratified it. It obligates governments to protect human rights, not just of your citizens, even that of foreigners. The Constitution, right, if you look at the preamble, the fundamental rights, they do provide this approach where the government is directed to protect human life. You look at Article 21, that provides right to life. Right to life is not just for Indian citizens, it applies to foreigners as well. Right? Life can be taken by the government only under procedure established by law. The right to life applies for everyone, not just for citizens of the country, even for foreigners, even for refugees. So if refugees are trying to save their lives, if they're running away from a conflict, entering your country asking asylum, it becomes a constitutional commitment in a way to protect them, right? And a global humanitarian obligation as well. But what is really worthy of criticism here is the public stand that India will deport them. See, this matter at the end of the day is a sovereign decision of the government. Whether you support it, whether you criticize it, doesn't matter at the end. The government will decide. The government has full discretion here, right? Based on various inputs, the government would have taken the right call. But one approach which comes for criticism, which also violates international law, is the stand that we took that we will identify the existing Rohingyas and will deport them back to Myanmar. This you cannot do. No country can deport refugees back to the place where they can face violence. This violates an international principle, a customary law called the principle of non-refoulement. If any country says that we will take the refugees, we'll deport them, we'll send them back to where they came from. If you're trying to deport them to a place where they still could be targeted, where they still could face violence, then such a country violates this principle called principle of non-refoulement. This is customary law. It's part of UN Charter. It's part of Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's part of the Refugee Convention. Whether you sign the Refugee Convention or not, whether you're party to it or not, it becomes an obligatory principle on every country that no government can forcefully deport refugees where they can face violence again, where they could be targeted again. So this is one stand which comes in for criticism. It marks a violation of international law. The UN pointed this out as well. The UN said India can't deport. If it does, it will be violating principle of non-refoulement. Is that clear? So looking at the crisis and the controversy, it's better that India comes out with a policy or a law to deal with refugee situations. Given that we have dealt with so many refugee crisis situations in the past, instead of allowing discretion to play a role, instead of leaving it to the government of the day, right? It's better we have a dedicated policy or a law in place. We should think of a refugee policy or maybe a refugee law. At the global level as well, efforts are being made to the UN. A global compact for migration is being adopted. It is still being developed. So right now, there is no global framework apart from Refugee Convention. Many countries don't support Refugee Convention. It's very outdated. It's very specific to Europe, specific to the World War context. It places many unnecessary burdens on governments that receive refugees. That is why many developing countries like India and others, they haven't signed Refugee Convention and the additional protocol. So what we need is a better global framework to the UN. All right? There's a global compact for migration, which is being developed. Global compact on migration to create one such global framework. India is also participating in these negotiations and discussions. So this is something you should make a note of, and we should also think of our own refugee policy or law at the domestic level. So there is a uniform approach to all refugees without any kind of discrimination. Right? But you can't deport refugees back to a place where they can be targeted, to a place where they can face violence, because that would violate the principle of non-refoulement. Whether you sign the Refugee Convention or not, this becomes a customary international obligation. Is that clear? Now the last point here, please note down the name of an island called Bhashan Char Island. You can see a small island here where the Meghna River of Bangladesh meets the Bay of Bengal. This is where you have the small island called the Bhashan Char Island. This island is frequently in news because this is where Bangladesh has set up a massive refugee camp to hold the Rohingya refugees. So it could be important for prelims. This island is frequently in news because of the refugee camp that Bangladesh has built here, but there's a controversy. Bangladesh has been criticized because this island is a low-lying island and it is very vulnerable to cyclones and coastal flooding. As you know, cyclones are common in Bay of Bengal. They strike Bangladesh as well. Rising sea levels are a threat because of climate change. Coastal flooding is quite common, right? There is a fear that Bhashan Char Island could get flooded or it could be hit by a devastating cyclone that will threaten the lives of refugees who are lodged over here. They can't move out, they can't escape from here, right? So many critics have pointed out that this is an inhuman approach of Bangladesh. But you should also understand Bangladesh is dealing with a massive burden. Lakhs of Rohingyas have come and that they have to be settled in Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. So at Bhashan Char Island, Bangladesh has built this massive refugee camp where it has settled some of these refugees, and there is criticism that Bangladesh is not focusing on the humane approach as the island faces the risk of flooding and disasters. That's why this island is in news. So please make a note of this for your prelims. Now, ideally, India as a regional power should have found a solution for the Rohingya crisis. As this became an issue between Myanmar and Bangladesh, we should have shown leadership and used our influence with Myanmar and Bangladesh to work out a solution that would settle the crisis and protect the Rohingyas. But unfortunately, India was silent. We didn't do anything to mediate between these countries or to resolve the crisis. Now I'm pointing this out because I'm pointing this out as a criticism. Because China exploited the vacuum left by India. See, we were the regional power. We were in the perfect position to resolve the crisis because we ourselves were getting affected by the crisis. And we had good influence with both governments. We were very friendly to both Bangladesh and Myanmar. We could have used our influence to settle the issue and work out a solution on humanitarian grounds to protect Rohingyas. But India left the issue open. We didn't step in. We left a power vacuum that China occupied very quickly. China was the one that stepped in 2016 and worked out a 3-step solution by bringing Bangladesh and Myanmar together. Thus, China cemented its influence in the region, and this was a lost opportunity for India. China convinced Myanmar for a ceasefire to halt the operations against ARSA. This was the first step in the 3-step solution. It convinced Myanmar to stop the counter-terror operations, to hold the fire, to call for a ceasefire. It urged both Myanmar and Bangladesh to protect and safeguard the Rohingyas, and it promised international support. It promised that it will use its global influence to get international support to funds which can be used by these countries to help the Rohingyas. That was the three-step solution that China worked out, whereas India was missing in action. So this is seen as a lost opportunity by strategic experts. If we are a regional global power, we have to cement that position by resolving such crisis situations. But we instead moved out of the situation. We got more preoccupied with the hostile approach that attracted criticism and controversy as well. And the power vacuum left by India was occupied by China, and China mediated between Bangladesh and Myanmar and worked out a three-step solution. That is why the conflict came down. Myanmar army agreed to a ceasefire. A ceasefire has been maintained till now. It ended the operations against ARSA. Both countries have settled the Rohingya population on both the sides, and international support was promised by China. Funding, donations from others was promised from China. So that is how China has cemented its influence and position. Coming to the last point, the Buddhist Circuit Initiative, we already discussed it, but I just wanted to make a note. As part of our cultural soft power diplomacy, we are promoting this initiative, and Myanmar is a key focus country as it's a Buddhist majority nation. 80% of Burmese population, they are Buddhists. It's a Buddhist majority country. So we are leveraging our Buddhist heritage, promoting our Buddhist influence as part of this cultural initiative. And Myanmar is also a focus country along with all the other Asian countries. So these are the major topics that you have to be familiar with as far as India-Myanmar relations are concerned. So this completes module number 4. We have had a very good discussion today. We completed the whole chapter along with many related topics. So let's wrap up the discussion for today. Let's look at some questions and doubts and then end the session. Tomorrow, we'll be starting with module 5. A very big topic, very important topic, that is India-Pakistan relations. So don't miss the class tomorrow. Please attend at any cost. All right. Now just stay with me for a few minutes. I'll take a look at your questions and doubts. Abhishek is asking, what is para-diplomacy? Para-diplomacy is a mix of official diplomatic channels and some non-official channels of engaging with the other side. For example, you might use retired officials, former diplomats, or you might use civil society activists, right? Anyone outside of the government. If they're also engaged in building an informal diplomatic relationship, right? That is called para-diplomacy. It involves a mix of formal and informal diplomatic links. Shreyank is asking, sir, why there is so much of secessionist tendencies in the Northeast? Why do we not listen to their demands? See, there are many reasons why separatist movements take root in Northeast India. One, of course, is the prolonged neglect and isolation of the region, the lack of development, right? And there are inter-tribal rivalries as well, like you see in Manipur, between Meiteis and Kukis, right? Between different ethnic groups and native indigenous communities, there are inter-group rivalries. This also drives insurgency in the region. And also, in general, some of the ethnic groups like Nagas, for example, they have felt a disconnect with India from the beginning. Even prior to independence, they had expressed their demands to remain independent of India. But as they were merged with India, eventually, with the Union of India, they felt it was a forceful merger. And they have resisted and opposed this. And that's one more reason why separatist movements thrive in Northeast India. Plus, there was a problem of illegal migration from Bangladesh. The large-scale influx of illegal migrants, which we studied in the previous chapter, triggered insurgencies in Assam and Tripura in 1970s. Because the native communities, the Assamese and Tripuris, they felt threatened by the illegal migrants coming from Bangladesh. They were threatened by the Bengali illegal migrants. So as opposition to illegal migration, insurgency took root in Assam and Tripura. So like this, there are different reasons, right? Very complex reasons in Northeast. There are political, economic, and socio-cultural reasons that are responsible for so many separatist movements in the Northeast. Akula says, you said nationalists are pro-India, now you're saying they're pro-Pakistan. I think Akula is referring to Bangladesh Nationalist Party. See, don't confuse Bangladesh Nationalist Party with the nationalists of Bangladesh. Both are different. Just because the word nationalist is there in BNP doesn't mean they are the nationalists. BNP is a pro-Pakistan party. It has constantly been against Indian interests. All right? Whereas when we say nationalists of Bangladesh, we are referring to those elements who support the liberation war. Those elements who believe in secular traditions, right? Such as Awami League, for example. They are the nationalists who fought for the independence of Bangladesh. They are pro-India. Is that clear? Whereas BNP is a political party which has been hostile to India and pro-Pakistan. So please understand that difference. Next. Shreyank says radical Buddhist seems to be like an oxymoron. How can anyone be a follower of Buddha and radical at the same time? That's the irony of religious fundamentalism, right? In any religion, you find these strands of extremism, right? The blame does not lie with any religion. There are these vested political elements who misinterpret their own faith, give it a wrong interpretation. And even Buddhism is not free from that. And that's highly ironic. Buddhism is the religion of peace. It's built on the principles of ahimsa. But even there you have these radical elements. Look at Sri Lanka. It was radical Sinhala Buddhists who targeted the Tamil minorities, right? So religious fundamentalism exists in every religion. There are these strands where these extremist elements, they misuse their faith, they misuse their religion, give it a wrong interpretation for their own selfish political interests. You'll study more about this in internal security. What are the reasons for so many military rules in so many countries? Neha is asking. See, military rules is usually a feature of developing or underdeveloped nations, right? Especially in underdeveloped countries where there is a lot of economic, social crisis. That is where these militaries become power hungry. They throw out governments, they start interfering in politics, right? And they take over power as well. You look at Africa. Africa is a classic example. In the last 4 years itself, there have been more than, I think, 15 military coups from Sudan to Niger to Mali. There are multiple African countries where the military has taken over again, right? So these are features of chaotic countries, underdeveloped, backward countries where there is a lot of corruption, poor economic progress, backwardness. And that is where the military gets an opportunity to enter into politics and they directly play a role in the power structures. So they throw out governments every now and then and capture power. Kamlesh is asking, can India play the role of a mediator in Myanmar? No, it won't be ideal for India. As I told you, that would be seen as India's interference. If you were to meddle with Myanmar's internal issues, Myanmar's army will retaliate against India. So India wouldn't do that. Abhishek is asking, sir, then what can the solution for the problem of refugees? As I told you, you act on humanitarian grounds and you should have a policy so that your approach is uniform towards them. There should be a global framework as well, which the UN is working on. Why India has never faced a military coup? Shubhajit is asking. That's because our armed forces are extremely professional, right? They are apolitical. They don't get involved in politics, right? We are civilian democracy, elected democracy, where the civilian government has complete authority over the armed forces, and the armed forces have fully accepted that constitutional obligation. Indian armed forces have never ever questioned the authority of the civilian government, right? That is the professionalism of Indian armed forces. They are completely apolitical. So it's thanks to our constitution, our political system, and even the armed forces, that armed forces have never meddled with the politics of the country. And that's how it should be. All right. So guys, these are the questions. So let's end the discussion for today. We'll meet again tomorrow and take up the next chapter, that is India-Pakistan. Do let me know how it went. I hope you guys liked today's discussion. So I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.